I've never much cared for religion. I mean, it's interesting and all. The old parables and philosophic insights from people 2 millennia removed from the present. I particularly enjoy the books of the Apocrypha and the Bible's magnum opus of Revelation, if for nothing else than interesting stories. Even some of the tenets, like an emphasis on strong family bonds and moral stature, I can resonate with. But in terms of a giant omnipresent entity that created everything, yet loves us unconditionally, watching our every move from unseen planes, yeah, I don't know about that. I still don't ascribe to a singular religious doctrine, but knowing what I know now, well, let's just say the title of atheist would be a little disingenuous. Staking my flag in that camp would contradict all my principles of the scientific method and first-hand observation. Try as I may, I cannot in good faith deny or refute what I myself witnessed. Calling whatever we discovered God may prove a bit remedial or inaccurate, but there is no denying it. We found something. Science has at times become this sort of monolithic and infallible institution, one that suffers from the ostracization of fringe concepts that fail to breach the egotistic blockade. It is all too often wielded as a trump card to negate all that doesn't assimilate to the prevailing narrative. Too often outlandish claims are torn asunder because no metrics exist to properly digest them. For all the good it has brought, science is still not and will never be an absolute. Nothing is. Absence of proof is not proof of absence. And what happened out there, in that lab deep below the frozen streets of Stockholm, now stands as a testament in my life to all the ventures humanity has yet to embark upon. It serves as an anchor, and if I ever find myself drifting away into the blissful seas of cognitive dissonance, it is there to remind me how small and naive I truly am. I graduated from UCLA with a bachelor's in physics, and an incredible opportunity landed in my lap. One of my professors had put in a good word for me, and I was contracted by a lab out of Stockholm and offered an internship. They were apparently impressed with my thesis, which delved into the topic of string theory and mathematic application to universal process. I, of course, accepted the offer without a moment's hesitation. From there, I uprooted my Californian lifestyle to move halfway around the world to the frigid north of Sweden. I was not prepared for the cold. Most of my summers were spent in a bikini, frolicking on the sandy beaches of Santa Monica and lounging in the sun. Sweden might as well have been another planet. Temperatures would plummet to a bone-chilling -30 degrees in the winter. Luckily for me, though, I had a marvelous host family who helped me acclimate myself and integrate into Valhalla. I was brought onto the team and slowly began the arduous process of melding into the group. They were all incredibly kind and welcoming, but still the feeling of being woefully outclassed by my colleagues was thick as tar pitch. The project consisted of over 50 men and women, all of them among the best the world had to offer. They hailed from Germany, Japan, Poland, Hong Kong, South Korea, and many other sovereign states. It was a melting pot of some of the greatest minds the world had to offer. Seeing them in their element and marveling at the way their minds hurdle asinine topics to delve straight to the cortex of reality was altogether incredible, and more than a little intimidating. The expressed goal of the coalition was to study the behavior of particles and the subatomic realm, to further decode the complex world of theoretic energy matrices. By extension, the group was also allotted resources to develop tools for observing and decoding quantum entanglement hypotheses, and the aforementioned string theory. These principles were still in their infancy at the time, and none of us could have ever imagined the enormous magnitude of the things that were to come. The lab had its very own particle accelerator, which I myself pretty much obsessed over from day one. Most of the concrete data, however, was relayed from the lab in Geneva, home of the largest Hadron Collider. I even got to see the magnificent machine in person on a few occasions. One thing that has always staggered me is the amount of incredible achievements capable when pursuit of knowledge guides the way. However, the complete polar opposite is also true, as curiosity without empathy all too often yields crimes against humanity. As you may already know, the Large Hadron Collider was the first machine capable of synthesizing the particle known as the Higgs boson. The machine is a particle accelerator built in a 27-kilometer loop. It uses a state of perpetual vacuum and temperature colder than that of outer space to accelerate particles to 99% the speed of light. The particles collide with one another, creating spectacular outbursts of radiation and results theorized to be similar to that of the Big Bang on a much smaller scale. It is also through this process that the infamous Higgs boson can be synthesized. Some call it the God particle, but many physicists are not fond of the omnipotent moniker. It is in a way suitable though, as it is ubiquitous and can spontaneously manifest or dematerialize through processes which are not yet entirely understood. It is a sort of bridge between matter and antimatter, the entity that binds the ethereal with the corporeal. It is the place between light and dark, hard to define. As once light ends, shadow begins and vice versa. The exact moment of intersection is difficult to pinpoint, but there is a definitive moment, and that moment is the Higgs boson. It was once thought that matter could only exist in one place at a time. However, the particle slit test of our progenitors proved otherwise. A particle accelerator was used to eject protons between one of two microscopic slits. They naturally assumed the protons would pass through either slit A or slit B, and when directly observed, their premise was corroborated. However, when an imprint background was installed to bypass direct observation, they noticed a peculiar detail. The particles produced what is known as a wave, or interference pattern on the imprint like ripples in a pond. This meant that the particles were interfering with themselves while simultaneously passing through both and neither of the slits. It was at first thought to be a false negative and an outright impossibility, but thousands of repeat experiments all reached the same conclusion. There was no denying it anymore. Matter can exist in more than one place at a time, and reality is altered simply by perceiving it. The world of particle physics is a strange one, and one which we only just begun to glimpse the majesty of. At times, it may even require us to suspend our own limited human understanding of things, to contemplate things beyond our mind's comprehension. It was this idea which was the tabernacle of all the group was trying to achieve: to unravel the mysteries of the subatomic universe and better understand reality itself. The group was funded exuberantly, and state-of-the-art equipment was provided from lavish donors from all around the world. My contemporaries and I began to study the processes again from square one. This consisted primarily of monitoring the nature of protons and testing the same process over and over, ad nauseam. Progress was slow, and many failures and errors were soon under our belts, but you can't build a house without chopping down a few trees. It took years to decode part of the formula, but eventually we learned that the behavior of these particles could be predicted under certain pretenses. They could also, to a certain extent, be directed, programmed to inhabit separate locations at the same time, giving them the perceived ability to exist in two places at once. In reality, though, it was more akin to a transfer of locale via microscopic slits in the Higgs boson. We realized it was not a matter of traveling to, but instead traveling through the fabric of space itself. With electrical stimuli and coordinate-based geosynchronization, one could manipulate these particles to transfer locations faster than the blink of an eye. The machine used was primitive compared to later iterations, but its true potential was not lost on us for a moment. Time went on, and the technique was further redefined. Most readily, in the distance particles were able to be transposed. It started as only a few nanometers, but eventually we could transfer particles several feet. It was through this process that blueprints for an entirely new type of machine were first devised. It was to be a machine unlike any before it. Instead of electrical stimuli sent through circuits and wires, it was transferred directly from one location to another. Wireless energy transposed through space. This greatly improved computing capabilities and allowed the machines to act much quicker than anything ever seen before. Initial ideals for the machine were skeptical at best, but as time went on, the real significance of its potential became apparent. When combined with a suitable processor and digital interface, it soon began decoding encryption and translating mathematical cipher in a fraction of the time of anything seen before it. It didn't stop there, though. With a binary converter, it wasn't long before human psychology itself was deciphered and converted into convenient little anagrams and simplistic formulas. This soon gave the machine the ability to replicate human tissue and organs from fetal stem cells. When given raw biomass, it could manufacture a duplicate heart or lung, one which was genetically indistinguishable from that of the donor's DNA. On one occasion, the machine even managed to regrow the arm of an amputee war veteran. Most of us thought it couldn't possibly work, that the nerve endings on the man's arms would be unable to resuscitate after so long. But after 17 hours in surgery, when I saw the vet move his new fingers for the first time, after transplant and cell resuscitation, I knew we had discovered something special. Disease and deformities were also unlocked, able to be observed on a molecular level and eradicated before gestation. A virus or bacterial strain could be genetically reprogrammed to attack and destroy itself rather than the host. HPV, AIDS, the Black Death, the common cold, strep throat, gonorrhea, none of them stood a snowball's chance in hell against the unrivaled power of the machine. I could even reprogram human DNA to desired proportions, eliminating extra chromosomes and restoring neural pathways to reverse entropic cognitive illnesses like dementia and Parkinson's. Even pre-birth conditions like cerebral palsy and microcephaly were in the process of being all but eradicated. It wasn't just organic material either. The machine could take a block of carbon and alter its isotopes to create carbon-14 and elicit radioactivity. This proved interesting for further power possibilities, as the machine demonstrated potential of creating its own fuel source. But there was another more pertinent discovery. By rearranging the number of protons in the atomic nucleus, the given element's atomic weight was altered, thereby turning it into another element altogether. The machine held the power to change the very building blocks of the universe itself. It could turn copper into gold, bromine into iodine. I think it was then that we first realized the scope of what it was that we had created. The applications for the machine seemed endless. It could write books, clone living organisms, and alter the very elements beneath our feet. It was the Philosopher's Stone, the Holy Grail and the all-seeing eye in one convenient little package. The Deus Ex Machina, the world's very first quantum computer, was born. One important distinction I would like to make: despite prevailing rumors, the quantum computer was not in fact an AI. It had computing power which trumped almost everything else on Earth 1,000 times over, and the ability to perform almost any task given to it provided the necessary accommodations were implemented. For this reason, it was not allowed to make decisions for itself. Many of the colleagues were justifiably nervous at the prospect of an AI somehow gaining sentience and going rampant with the power of quantum manipulation. We really had no idea where our experimentation would lead us, and so the decision was made early on, to prevent it from thinking on its own and going all Skynet on us. The computer was a beast of burden, happily doing any task given to it, but it was us that held the reins. That was when the bureaucratic troubles first began. A lot of donors for the project, and even a few of my fellow team members, had their own ideas on how to best utilize the machine. Every nation involved wanted it for themselves and had their own vision on how to best implement its capabilities. Several members of the coalition ended up leaving the project or being outright dismissed, promising to return with a battalion of lawyers at their back. One man was even caught attempting to smuggle data from the lab and detained to await prosecution. The reigning project overseer was also relieved of duty. In his place, Dr. Henrik Lundgren assumed the role of Director of Operations. Dr. Lundgren is a dear friend and a brilliant mind. That's what makes his fate lie so heavily on my heart. It's a tragedy what befell him, but I won't act as though he wasn't responsible for stoking the flames. Lundgren managed to settle the group down and unite a divided faction of scientists who all held their own agendas. He made the executive decision to keep the computer in the hands of the international team and continue to study it for optimum replication and continued data analysis. All those who didn't abide were dismissed or removed physically as the need arose. Lundgren had toiled for years on development of the machine's virtual capabilities and decided it best to invest more heavily into it. It took months to develop, but soon, a fully functional Sims-esque program was up and running. It was incredible. The simulation was modeled to be an exact carbon copy of our own world, and held all the coordinating pieces within it. All the people, animals, and nations, augmented control apparatuses were then developed to allow us the ability to view the computer's creation firsthand. The simulation it created was so visceral that none could even perceive that they were in a simulation at all. Test subjects were exposed to their own loved ones within the program and could not distinguish them from their real-life counterparts. I even took it for a spin a few times. I was hooked up to the monitor via a neural cortex interface and had my mind rendered into the simulation. I awoke to the sights of sunlight peeking through my blinds and the sounds of cars outside. Around me on the walls were posters of Harry Potter, JoJo, and the X-Files among countless others. I recognized immediately where I was. It was my childhood home, an apartment complex in Sacramento. My parents were both there and acted in accordance to how they would behave in real life. My dad even made new corny jokes in a fashion that suited his personality. It wasn't a memory though. It was an entirely new scenario, concocted by my mind and the quantum simulation. My parents were both deceased in the real world, and getting to spend time with them again was indescribable. Even if they were just simulations, the experience was profoundly cathartic for me. I ended up leaving the simulation in tears, overwhelmed by the experience and the ability to speak with my parents once again. The event was so enlightening for me, it even made dealing with their absence a little easier. After all, I could now speak to them anytime I wanted. I found myself never wanting to leave the Matrix. Dr. Lundgren subsequently questioned me about my experience, and I was all too happy to relay the things I had seen. He listened intently, with simple occasional nods and one-word responses. His grave face wore a smile, and cheeks dimpled in delight, but his eyes were far from the present and worried. We held a meeting with all staff members sometimes after. Lundgren stood and paced in front of the group, silent and lost in thought. When he did finally speak, he held our undivided attention. He walked through all that our little group had managed to accomplish, and all the things we had learned on our journey, all the miracles unraveled and translated into digital coding, and all the advancements made. It was not a triumphant voice, however. It was somber, as if none of it truly mattered. He then first proposed his theory. Here we were, with an entire simulated universe at the tips of our fingers. A digital reality created and maintained by a machine we had built. A simulation which was so authentic that none could tell it apart from reality itself. And if we had the power to create that, how did we know that our own universe was not the result of the same process? How did we know our reality was not in fact just a simulation? An unnerving silence befell the rest of the group as Lundgren concluded his epiphany. All in attendance seemed to silently contemplate the idea, with a noticeably nervous aura now lingering. There wasn't much said after that, but there didn't need to be. We had an entirely new goal. Upon returning for work the following day, I immediately noticed that several of our colleagues had abandoned the project without so much as a goodbye. Only 7 of us remained, among which was the prestigious Henrik Lundgren. He was changed, though. His upbeat optimism and inquisitive attitude reverted to an impatient, gibbering wreck of a man. He became hostile to prolonged questions, and I could see the idea gnaw on his mind as he walked the tightrope between madness and genius. At times he appeared on the verge of catatonic psychosis. He would ramble and talk to himself, and pretty much stopped leaving the laboratory altogether. We set our sights on a new task, to dismantle and test the hypothesis of Lundgren, to develop an ability to break through the boundaries of our suspected simulation and peer beyond our own reality and glimpse whatever may lie on the other side. Nothing else seemed to matter anymore by that point. Life may be accidental, consciousness too. Hell, even complex organisms like human beings are the result of genetic evolution and a bit of luck. However, simulation is not accidental. It requires an immense amount of dedication, programming and logistics, not to mention power and maintenance. The ability to synthesize digital worlds is not something learned or accomplished by accident. It takes time, resources, and brain power to even attempt it. And even then, it is no guarantee. The one concept that was off the table immediately was that the theorized simulation was the result of natural phenomenon, or a random cosmic alignment. If Lundgren's hypothesis was correct, and our universe was indeed an illusion, then someone or something had to be pulling the strings behind the veil. Powerful as the quantum computer was, even it did not have the ability to glimpse directly into higher dimensions. As stated before, it took commands only from us, and could only perform tasks which we could coherently articulate to it. We realized rather early that directly viewing outside the boundaries of the universe was likely not possible. The only option was to send a message. Through remedial experimentation and dozens of ponderous sleepless nights, we finally had a breakthrough. Our reality is based on laws. Laws of motion, laws of attraction, laws of physics. These laws cannot be broken accidentally, but with quantum technology, they can be manipulated. Many believe that intelligent extraterrestrials were first altered to humanity when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Ours was essentially the same idea, demonstrating that we had the capability to toil with the quantum world in hopes of eliciting a response from a higher being. If we could break or bend one of these laws of reality, then perhaps the supposed orchestrator would be compelled to respond. One of the earlier discoveries we made was that of the concept of reverse time. Time is a measurement of something that occurs, and without anything to observe, time is meaningless. The concept only makes sense when in the presence of matter. The two concepts of space and time are coterminous. Like light and dark or hot or cold, one does not exist without the other. Where there is space, there is time, and where there is time, there must be space. The opposite of matter is not nothing, but antimatter. A true nothingness or void of anything substantial does not exist. It cannot exist based upon the nature of existence itself. Antimatter is the invisible material which operates unseen and fills all the gaps which matter does not. All of it held together by the Higgs boson. If an opposite of matter exists, then an opposite of time must as well. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and all reactions must remain proportional to force exerted. By utilizing the quantum computer, we had the ability to send protons back in time. Sort of. We could make them exist where they once had not, before they existed there, by using dark energy matrices and particle superpositioning to make them exist in two places at once. The discovery had actually been made sometime earlier, but never officially tested. It was restricted and marked as unbroachable, as many of our patrons were rightfully concerned by the prospects of unintentionally altering the past. Doing so could create a butterfly effect and wreak havoc upon the present. We were told vehemently that reverse time experimentation was forbidden, but now we had a legitimate reason to take interest. It took some convincing on our end, but eventually we were successful when we promised to unveil the greatest discovery yet. The parameters were set within the computer and the lab was prepped for the operation. A single seed of Dianthus caryophyllus was placed in a transparent reinforced container in the center of the room. The specimen was placed on damp resin paper, and several little green tendrils had sprouted from its shell. The idea was to reverse the symbiotic metabolism of the test subject and cause it to rapidly revert to a zygote state. The seed would be directed to perform its life cycle backwards, thereby contradicting the natural flow of life and time. The parameters were finished, and Lundgren stood by the machine. He glanced to each of us individually, a sullen demeanor and nervous twinkle in his eye. He looked to me last, and I nodded. Lundgren took a deep breath, adjusted his glasses, and flipped the switch. Immediately, the tendrils within the seed began to react. They disappeared within the shell soon after, and the seed shrunk until the point in which it was no longer visible. The computer altered us that the task had been completed, and silence descended upon the crew. We stayed that way for several seconds until a commotion from the computer drew our attention. An array of flickering lights and sirens began to wail like banshees, indicating an error of some sort. Suddenly the seed reappeared and began to grow at an impossible rate. A mass of wriggling green tendrils erupted from the shell and pressed firmly against the case within seconds. It swelled within, and the chamber violently ruptured a moment later, sending shards of glass catapulting throughout the room. I managed to duck away just in time, but others in the group were not so lucky. One man, Reginald Diabeck, was struck with a shard in the neck. The piece cut a gash across his throat, causing a thick crimson to spill forth from his gullet. He collapsed to the ground as others began to rush to his aid. Before we could reach him, the engorged serpentine appendages of the seed ensnared him, slithering around his neck and abdomen. Diabeck gurgled and terror filled his eyes as the green pythonic roots began to constrict him. I watched, at a loss for words, as Diabeck's wounds sealed. His gray hair turned to dark brown, The wrinkles on his forehead and bags below his eyes dissolved into his skin in a matter of seconds. The blackheads and liver spots on his cheeks soon followed suit. All of us watched, stupefied as the process continued onwards, and Diabetic appeared to age backwards. Diabetic had to have been nearly 60 years old, but in a matter of moments, he appeared as though he was a young man in his early 30s. He then went young adult, then juvenile, then teenager. Diabetic screamed in terror as his voice cracked from a gruff, raspy tone to a high-pitched prepubescent shriek. His body shrunk in his clothes, and his extremities retracted within his coat. By the time we had reached him, he was gone. We didn't have time to gawk, as our stupor was interrupted by the computer blaring a warning siren and a flickering plethora of lights designated an external problem of some sort. The display was a failsafe designed to protect the computer from malicious outside sources. Most of us thought the firewalls of the quantum computer were enough to prevent any attempted breach, but apparently we were wrong. One of my colleagues scrambled to the kill switch. He was poised to throw it when he was halted by the sudden shout from Lundgren. Lundgren stood, eyes wide as dinner plates and mouth agape as he stared at the main monitor of the computer. The warning display had ceased, and only a single screen remained active. Upon it was displayed a single loading bar, with approximately 20% of it being filled in. This indicated only one thing. Something was being downloaded. We immediately surmised that it must be a virus or other malware of some sort, a prospect once thought impossible based on the security measures of the computer, and yet the download persevered. All attempts made to restrict the download and halt its progress proved futile. We exchanged nervous glances with one another, torn on whether to pull the plug and save our creation from hostile insurgents, or allow it to continue to whatever ends. The call was eventually made by the investors outside the room, who had since been notified of the development. They demanded power be cut and the machine be saved. The computer represented a colossal investment, and the cost to repair or replace it if any damage were to ensue was not something taken lightly. Begrudgingly, Lundgren followed orders and commanded shutdown protocol. It was done straight away, but the machine did not power down. It continued, impossibly, and without a direct power source sustaining it. Panic began to erupt from the lab, and power to the entire facility was ordered to be cut from the mainframe. It was done within seconds, and the room fell into darkness. The only light that remained was that of the main monitor as the download reached the halfway mark. The computer groaned and whirled under enormous duress as hundreds of fans shot to life to attempt to cool the Leviathan machine. We stood back, unable to make heads or tails of the development. There was simply no possible way that the machine should have remained active, and yet it was. It continued to fill up the progress bar, powered by the fuel of some unknown outside source. With no other viable solutions at hand, barring physical destruction of the computer itself, we could do nothing but await the culmination. The download finished several minutes later, and the room fell into pitch black. We deliberated for a moment, before deciding our only recourse was to power up the computer once again. The mysterious file weighed in at an impressive 100,000 terabytes, enough to fill hundreds of normal hard drives, but just another drop in the ocean for the quantum computer. Once full mobility was achieved, a single never-before-seen prompt filled the screen. Unknown file type. Do you wish to execute the file? All attempts made to bypass the prompt failed. We quickly used the separate program on another screen to trace the file's origin, but to no avail. Now, there is no hiding from a quantum computer behind a proxy or VPN. It uses algorithm-based process combined with ping response speed to determine probable origin up to an accuracy of 99.999%. We're talking response time measured in millionths of a second, but for a quantum computer, it's as simple as the ABCs. Sure, it gets it wrong once in every million attempts, but the point is, it always has a guess. This time, however, we received a new message. Unable to determine file origin, Lundgren took a step back and pondered the situation and wiped the beads of glistening sweat from his brow. With nothing else at our disposal, he realized there was only one option left, and so he gave one last command. Open it. The computer began to render the file, the process taking several minutes to complete. It was entirely in binary code, and eventually translated to a single message. Upon completion, 2 words in white font sat silently amidst the black background. I never thought 2 simple words could have such lasting effects on my psyche. Those 2 words that have made me question everything I thought I ever knew. The computer fizzled out moments later and shut down. All of us just kind of left after that. I returned home, overwhelmed by the events and left with a mystic sense of terror and still deep in my stomach. The following morning, I was called by one of the investors. He informed me that someone had broken into the lab the previous night and sabotaged the operation. The lab was lit ablaze and soon reduced to a smoldering pile of ash, and the quantum computer was damaged beyond repair. Whoever had done it possessed a security card and seemed to know the exact process required to dismantle the automatic sprinkler system. Police held a single suspect in custody, a man who appeared as a neurotic mess in the center of a maniacal nervous breakdown. He was tried and convicted sometime later and declared clinically insane. He was ordained to a mental health facility in northern Sweden, and it is there that he remains to this day. That man's name? Henrik Lundgren. I've never been able to properly assess just what it was that happened that day. The event has left me shaken and confused in more ways than I could possibly list. I don't suppose I'll ever be whole again. I just can't be. I know the truth, the reason for our meager existence. We had reached out far beyond, and something had answered our call. Whether or not it was truly what we would call God, I cannot possibly say. But I will say, after what I saw happen to Diabek, and what became of Lundgren, I can't think of a better word for it. I think God is something we never could have imagined. It holds us all within the palm of its hand, and with a simple flick of the wrist, we would cease to be. There is no love. There is no salvation. There is only that which lies beyond the margins of reality. That which we have no possible hope in understanding, let alone combating. One thing is also certain. It is watching us, and it does not want us meddling in that which we have no business seeing. We are set amidst the notion of infinite black seas, and it was not meant for us to travel far. That final message could not have been clearer, and any time I find myself drifting, I remember those 2 simple words relayed by the quantum computer in its last moments of life. Turn back. I'm a time traveler from the year 2345. I'm sorry for what's coming. Okay, let me just start off by saying that I know damn well that none of you are going to believe me. After all, at this stage in time, the idea of time travel is just barely moving from something which is shunned by the scientific community and world in general to its infancy of being taken seriously. And you have so many people who LARP as time travelers, who truly aren't, even right here on Reddit. Hell, the time travel subreddit is full of them. But regardless of whether you believe or not, I assure you I am a real one. I will say right off the bat that I won't give you my real name, for the simple reason that, well, I'm actually alive right now, in 2023. To be more specific, the past version of me is alive right now, and I can't afford to let history change, for reasons I'll go into a minute. I also won't get into much information about the future in relation to things such as politics or such, so please don't ask. But I suppose I should give you a few rather vague details which may help convince you as time goes on that I'm telling the truth. It may help convince the right people that my warning is real. For starters, less than 2 or 3 decades from now, not only have the cures for cancer and other major debilitating diseases have been found, but they can be administered from a simple vaccine shot. In a way, the pandemic we went through helped accelerate their development. We also end up making death itself more of a choice than an inevitability. Life extension research being conducted right now leads to both the ability to live for centuries, if not longer, but also retain our youthful bodies for as long as you wish. Which means many of you reading this might still be alive in my time. I was one of those who jumped on the bandwagon after they finished working the bugs out of it. I mean, imagine having the body of yourself in your 20s with all the knowledge and wisdom you accrue from living so long. Not to mention being able to do all the things which a single natural lifetime wouldn't allow. It gets some pushback at first by people who worry about living beyond a natural lifetime. Gasoline is banned by the halfway point of this century, but synthetic fuel means people aren't forced into electric cars, which I was extremely happy about, because it meant I could keep driving my Cadillac DeVille around. Although many people got hooked on the flying car craze that happens towards the end of the 21st century. Not me, though. I prefer staying on the ground. Trust me, mid-air accidents are not pretty. However, space travel took off after the Artemis missions put people back on the moon. A few years from now for you guys. And once the moon base and spaceport was constructed, well, it was off to the races from there. Vacations to planets like Mars, along with planetary moons such as Europa and Titan, become regular occurrences, even for those not so wealthy. And as for time travel, well, that took a little while longer than anticipated to actually work on. And that's the reason why I'm writing this now. You see, there were many discussions that happened as people began to take time travel more and more seriously. Not only to the future, which could already be done with time dilation, but to the past. It almost became as much of a race for every country in the world as the space race in the 60s had been. Everyone wanted to be written into the history books for eternity, as the ones who finally invented the ability to travel through time itself. But people weren't really rushing like they used to, when they only had a century or less to live. Scientists could work much longer, without worrying about retiring or dying. During the first part of this time, I honestly wasn't a part of the endeavor myself. I'd more or less turned my life around from the second I realized I would be able to live far longer than I thought I would before. I made something of myself, and without getting into too many specific details, as again I want my identity to remain protected, I will say I became a best-selling author, an explorer who did everything from climbing Mount Everest on Earth and Olympus Mons on Mars, to using the vast wealth I made from writing and other business endeavors to create underwater cities, similar in design to how Rapture from the BioShock video game looked. I was living my best life from the latter half of the 21st century to the midway point of the 23rd. But there was something that kept pulling away at my mind all throughout it. You see, I'd done so much, checked so many things off my bucket list, but there was one thing that hadn't happened yet. And if you guessed that it was that I wanted to time travel, then congratulations, you've just won a trip for two to Europa. Ever since I had been a little child, growing up at the very tail end of the 20th century and the early 21st, I'd wanted to visit the past. I wanted to do things such as attend the 9th annual Cannes Film Festival in 1956 to see Jacques Cousteau's The Silent World win the Golden Palm Award, see extinct animals such as the Barbary lion and the Tasmanian tiger, and travel across the ocean on the old ocean liners such as the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, for starters. That was how they hooked me into funding much of the research. You see, a venture capitalist whose real name I won't use, but for the sake of telling this we'll call Reynolds, approached me as one of the first big investors. He'd heard me mention my desire to time travel during my book tours. Hell, I'd actually written an entire book series about it. That's why when he called me that day, I immediately shot straight up in my chair, paying close attention. "Son," he said over the video screen on my desk, "I've known for a long time now that you want to visit the past." I saw a smile break across his face. "Well, what if I told you that we are the ones closest to actually achieving it? And if you're willing to invest a little time and money into my project, that I will allow you to become one of the first to actually travel to the past?" I leaned forward in my chair. "Well, then I would say you now have my attention, Mr. Reynolds." From that moment on, I was hooked. I was brought to his laboratory where I was honestly shocked to find he wasn't lying. They were closer than any of the hundreds of governments or private entities attempting to master it. Even to me, it was extremely complicated to understand, but I'll try to explain what he found in layman's terms. Many scientists right now in this century believe that if you traveled near a black hole, you would experience time dilation. This means 1 year near the edge of one would mean 80 years or so back on Earth. And it was already proven in 2190, when a space exploration which had left at the beginning of the 21st century came back looking exactly as they had almost a century prior. There's also a theory that black holes could work in reverse, operating as wormholes to both teleport and send people back in time. The issue is, it was found you'd need a particle accelerator almost 1 billion kilometers long, along with a stable wormhole. Both were almost a complete impossibility, until Reynolds' team came up with a discovery. They were not only able to use a particle accelerator much smaller, but they were also able to create an artificial wormhole, a man-made black hole, in their lab. Naturally, many people, myself included, were concerned about this. I asked Reynolds if there was any safeguards to prevent the artificial black hole from rapidly growing on its own. He pointed upwards at the particle accelerator hanging from the ceiling. "Victor, my boy, the particle accelerator has over 90 million sensors monitoring the hole, which, if they detect any kind of anomaly or rapid growth of its own volition beyond our parameters, it'll trigger an emergency shutdown which will zap the hole into non-existence." He slapped me on the back. "You have nothing to be concerned about." I took him for his word at it. So fucking stupid of myself to simply let it go at that. But I was blinded by how close we were to being able to conquer not only space, but time as well. And in the year 2338, we finally attempted our first use of the artificial wormhole to open a portal to the past. Nothing too far back in time. We decided for a dry run to only go as far back as one single year. Everyone, scientists, other investors, even the janitorial staff crowded into the lab's viewing area, anxious to see if the work which had taken trillions of dollars and literally centuries would actually pay off. And it did. To both our utter shock and amazement, the wormhole opened. Through the glass and through it, we could see something displayed on the other end of it. We saw the lab, looking as it had this same time last year. That wasn't what made our jaws drop, though. They dropped because we saw ourselves. I could see myself being led around the chamber by Reynolds and his team, detailing me on the advancements we were now seeing the result of. I turned to Reynolds, finding him staring at the sight before us with such a sense of pride and accomplishment. I felt my own grin begin to stretch across my face. It's actually possible, I thought ecstatically in my head. After so many centuries of hoping, it's actually fucking possible. I saw Reynolds turn to me, the man's smile wider than my own, if that was possible. "Now do you believe me, Victor?" he asked. For a moment there was complete stillness in the viewing area, and then everyone burst into cheers and applause. We began shaking each other's hands and hugging each other, congratulating ourselves on achieving first what no one else had been able to. Reynolds then told us to keep what we'd seen under our hats. There was a scientific convention coming up in a few years, where he wanted to reveal to the world our achievement. We were all too giddy and too busy basking in our own glory to stop to think about the implications of such a decision. Things such as safety protocols and proper procedures never crossed our minds. That mistake was not only the first major one, but the worst. I don't think what happened would have if we'd revealed our findings right then and there. We hit a few snags after that. You see, we could easily open up a wormhole to a few years back, just as easily to a few decades back. Hell, even a century and a half back took a little more energy, but was doable. So was being able to cross from one end of the wormhole in the present to the past, and returning. We created a portable version of the particle accelerator and wormhole, which allowed us to move from the present to the past. Theoretically, you could use the portable pad to keep hopping back in time further and further. However, to return to the present, you needed the main unit. No one could find a way to engineer returning into the portable pad. The problem was, the further into the past you wanted to go, the more energy was used, and the larger the wormhole had to be to traverse such a long distance. The particle accelerator began to short out at times, causing us to limit our explorations until repairs could be made. One of the investors, Travis, approached me after meeting with Reynolds in the spring of 2345 to voice his concerns. "What worries me is that if he attempts to open a portal too far back in time at once, it may short out the safeguards, Vic," he said, looking around to make sure he wasn't overheard. Reynolds had put most of us on edge as of late. If I was fixated on visiting the past, then he was utterly obsessed with it. He never let up on why, but the old photo of him and his mother, someone who'd passed centuries ago, gave me a small clue to his motives. But whenever we voiced our concerns now, instead of placating replies and reassurances, he'd snap and almost seem like he was about to hit you. "Honestly, I worry about it as well, but what can we do?" I whispered back to him. "Nobody but us knows about how far we are, And if we even try to mention anything to anyone outside our own group, God only knows what he'll do. Especially where the reveal is less than 2 months away. Travis took a deep breath. I don't care. This is far too dangerous to keep hidden any longer. Someone has to tell someone outside. And with that, he turned and walked away. I watched him go, unaware that behind me, a tiny remote security bug had been watching us before scampering away. I mulled over his words for about a month and a half, unsure of what to do. Finally, with only a few days until the world reveal, I decided to return to the lab and speak to Reynolds. Unlike the others, the man was still somewhat friendly with me, and I felt still trusting enough to hear me out. I entered the lab using my personal keycard, noting that he wasn't in his office. I could tell he'd been here recently though. The coffee warmer on his desk still glowed slightly red, and the cup beside it still had steam rising out of it, so I turned and headed for the observation area. As I drew closer, I heard voices. I couldn't tell whose they were yet, and I began to slow as I heard what sounded like angry, almost frantic pleadings from one. I froze, feeling a chill run up my spine. Did someone break into the lab? I looked down, seeing a discarded metal pipe from a recent repair job, and picked it up. Feeling every muscle in my body tense up, I hit the button to open the pneumatic doors into the observation room and slid inside. Nobody was in here, but I could now tell the voices were coming from the main room itself. I crouched walked to the glass and slowly peeked over it. What I saw made me nearly drop the pipe. Reynolds stood in the room, almost directly under the particle accelerator. Around him were about 10 or 12 of his personal security team. That wasn't the worst sight, though. Oh God. Travis lay on an old medical gurney, the types you use to see in old mental hospitals from the 20th century. His arms and legs were strapped tightly down, and he struggled to free himself from the restraints. The intercom to the room had been left on, and I could now hear what the voices were saying. "Listen, Reynolds," Travis shouted. "You don't know what you're doing. The wormhole is too unstable to demonstrate it before a crowd, especially where you want to open it up so far back in time at once. You don't know what will happen." For a moment, Reynolds stayed silent. Then he began to chuckle. It wasn't a normal laugh, though. It sounded absolutely insane. I've seen quite literally millions of horror movies in my lifetime, and heard so many insane evil laughs. Hearing one for real, though, made me shudder. He began to speak back to Travis quietly, too softly for me to hear, but whatever he said made a look of complete horror fall over Travis's face. "Oh my God," he moaned out. A feeling of dread began to course through me. Even though I didn't know what Reynolds had told him, I knew it wasn't good. The man patted Travis on the shoulder and finally said something I could make out. "You'll be the first, Travis, for my own eyes to see, before the big reveal. And nothing you, Victor, or anyone else can do is going to stop me." He began to walk towards the exit. "Goodbye, Travis," he said, and then exited the lab. I knew where he was coming now. He was coming to the observation room, and God only knew what he'd do if he found me here. There was only a single door out of the room, though I knew it was far too late to try and escape through it. The unhinged man was now on his way here, and would see me exiting it. A rather large air duct with its cover off for repairs caught my eye, and I set down the pipe as I heard voices approach the door. One thing caught my eye before I climbed up into the vent. An object slouched in a canvas bag, and in the few seconds I had left, I snatched it up, then climbed onto the table in the middle of the room, and finally into the vent. I made it just in time, as I heard the pneumatic doors open less than a second later, and saw through the opening Reynolds and his goons step in up to the glass. A moment later, the lights in the lab began to flicker and weaken. Horror as palpable as I ever felt surged through me. He's turning on the particle accelerator to open the wormhole. Through the glass, I saw Travis struggle in vain to break free. Below me, I heard Reynolds let out a low, evil chuckle. Then he turned to the man to his left. "Do it," he said flatly. In response, the man slammed his meaty fist into a red button on the side of the wall, and I had to slap both of my hands over my mouth to keep from screaming. Have you ever heard about something called spaghettification? It's what scientists, both now in this time and in the future, call what happens when a black hole swallows an object in its path. Whether it's a star, a planet, or in this case, a person. The wormhole opened, and as it did, Travis began to scream. It was the most pained, agonizing scream I've heard a human being make. As it did, I saw both him and the gurney begin to get pulled toward the opening black hole. That wasn't the most horrible part, though. As he approached it, both he and the gurney seemed to begin to stretch out, and at the same time, compress, as if he was a Laffy Taffy being stretched and pulled on a machine. His screams began to sound off, tinny. It rose several octaves. They say that if a human being was sucked into a black hole, the process of spaghettification would be one of the most horrific, painful ways to die. I can confidently say they were fucking understating that hypothesis. It was all over in a span of about 20 seconds for us. But I knew for Travis, what had been seconds for us had been an eternity of dying for him, due to time dilation. The accelerator was turned off, and the black hole wavered for a moment before vanishing. When it was gone, Reynolds turned to his men. "Ready the plans and items needed for the world reveal. I want everything to be in place for when it's time," he said. One guard nodded. "Yes, sir. We'll have it all ready." The man I'd once considered my partner and friend began to walk towards the room, when the guard called after him. "And if Victor should come poking his nose around here while you're gone?" he asked. I felt a surge of fear and horror splash through me as the question was answered. "Then end him the same way we did Travis. I'll not have him interfering in this. Actually," he held up a finger, "don't do that. Go out after this and find him. Put him in my personal jet and put him the farthest distance away. He deserves what's coming almost more than anyone else, and I want him to be the one of the last to go." And with that, he turned and strode out of the lab. I couldn't help but shake uncontrollably in the cramped middle space at his words as the guards gathered some papers and equipment, then left the lab. It took me a long time to climb down from that vent and sneak out of the lab. I was terrified that I'd be caught at any moment, but I managed to make it out unseen. I didn't go back to my home, any of my homes across the world actually. I knew there'd be men at all of them, waiting for me. Instead, I did something I hadn't in centuries, and returned to my poor and humble roots. I first withdrew all the money and gold I could from my bank accounts, knowing I'd need it, and ended up taking refuge in an extremely run-down motel in the city, one which advertised itself as an authentic early 21st century motel experience. It was for technophobes, people who were afraid or hated technology to stay when needing to go out from their homes. While there, I frantically tried contacting anyone I could to warn them, especially after discovering a typed printed out speech, something I hadn't seen in centuries, stuffed into a pocket of the bag. Most of it related to the reveal speech, but the last part was what caused me to try calling anyone in power in such a panic. Even now, the words of what turned into a twisted manifesto still fill me with such horror I can describe. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I must end this presentation with a bit of an admission. This device can, indeed, open a wormhole through time. It can allow humanity to traverse time and space, allow us to move freely to the past and future at will. But that was only a side effect. It was not what I secretly designed this machine for in the first place. You see, humanity, to me, as it is now, is abhorrent. It's disgusting, an aberration. It has been ever since I was a child, and had my mother and father educate me on how evil a species we were. To the environment, to each other, and to the universe as a whole. They both became anti-natalists in their old age, and passed those views on to me. At first, I didn't understand why they and those like them wanted not just humans, but all sapient sentient life to cease to exist. But, as the centuries have gone on, I've come to understand their views. Humans were never meant to live this long. Many of us, both here in the audience and watching at home, were never meant to live as long as we have. We all should have done the right thing and died a long time ago. It's disgusting to let ourselves live on. Every year I keep living was one I hated. But I know I'll never get the majority of others to agree with my views. Our views, the anti-natalist. And so, in secret, I have worked with them for centuries on a final plan. To make the choice for you. For all of us. None of you deserve to keep living beyond today. None of us either. All sapient, sentient life in the universe needs to do the right thing and cease to exist. And none of you deserve to be able to travel through time. This is the moment for humanity, for everything to end. And it's too late to escape. May the universe be bettered by the erasure of all life. Goodbye. And now I should probably explain why I'm telling you all of this. How I managed to travel back here. Why I'm revealing all these things. It's because I wasn't able to stop Reynolds. I tried desperately for days to get through to anyone in the government, to warn them. I left message after message, but just like the government now, it's such a fucking mess in the future that either nobody got my message, or they were just ignored as a hoax. At least, not until it was far too late to stop. Because on August 17th, 2345, at exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, Reynolds walked on stage in front of millions of people in the audience in the remodeled Los Angeles Convention Center, and with billions more watching all over the world. He revealed his machine, which he'd moved to the center from the lab, and did exactly as the prepared speech had gone. The world gasped as it thought it had opened up a new age in humanity's existence, able to not only reach the stars, but also the future and past. I watched it on the ancient, barely functioning smart TV in my motel room as I frantically prepared. I saw the moment he launched into his manifesto speech. I saw the realization begin to spread over the crowd. The looks of excitement and glee melting into existential dread and horror. A few tried to rush to stop him, but his guards, ones I realized were also anti-natalist, shot them. It didn't matter whether they were men or women. They were shot like rabid animals with no remorse. And then Reynolds pulled the lever. The screens didn't stay up long, nor did I wait around to watch much. But the little I did will stay burned into my memory for the rest of my existence. The black hole opened, growing rapidly, far more so than I ever saw it do before. It was a runaway black hole, one which might never stop growing. I saw the start of millions of people begin the process of spaghettification. The screams of pain and agony of millions of lives ending at once. To them, drawn out for a literal eternity of horrific stretching and peeling into oblivion, must be what the deepest pits of hell, filled with the damned, sound like. Before the end of the day, Earth was gone, sucked into the ever-expanding black hole. Billions of lives were ended in the most horrific, painful way imaginable, and with no way to attempt to escape, as all of Earth was inside the event horizon. And for all I know, it kept growing. For all I know, it ate the entire galaxy. It is on its way to swallow the entire universe, ending every sapient, sentient thing in existence. I don't know. I never saw it. You see, the thing I grabbed in that canvas bag that day, which sat along with the copy of Reynolds' speech, the thing I saw which made me snatch it up in the first place, was the portable pad. I guess the maniac never thought about it again, seeing as how he never planned for it to be used properly. And as I witnessed the final few moments of his speech, I frantically typed in a random date, a century before, into the wrist-mounted destination selector. I just barely managed to send myself back in time before Los Angeles was obliterated. It's taken me a little while to make it all the way back here, to 2023. I didn't dare jump more than a few decades back at a time after the first large jump. I was in untested waters, and I didn't want to accidentally destabilize the wormhole and end up doing to myself what had been done to everyone else. And I found jumping back can physically drain you. It doesn't cause any adverse effects such as cancer or tumors to grow, thank God, but it does tire you out, causing you to sleep for 2 or 3 days straight. And I should explain why I'm here in the first place. First, I have to say I am so sorry. I'm so sorry that I was so blind, so easily able to be used for my money to have such an evil plan enacted. I am so sorry that, whether or not I meant for it to happen, I was a part of what happened. I'm so sorry I was allowed, in my pursuit of a centuries-long dream, to become a pawn. But I have a plan, to try and prevent that horrific evil act, one of which makes all prior human atrocities, like Tonka toys in comparison, from happening. It will require a sacrifice from me, however. I do believe it will cost me a piece of myself, a piece of my soul. You see, I won't be able to strike and try and kill Reynolds in his adulthood, due to the wealth and power he gained from his parents' fortune. I already had thought of that when I landed back in the mid-23rd century. Which means, like all those people here online who spoke about what they wanted to do with some other horrible evil men, dictators, if they got their hands on time travel, I must. No, I cannot bring myself to say it outright, even for the most evil man in existence. I cannot bring myself to outright say what I feel I must do, in the way I must do it. And I know it will be one of the hardest things to live with, once I've done it. But it must be done. That is why, before I do this, I'm making one final jump back from here, to give myself a final chance of happiness and peace, for a few decades, almost a century. I'm going to give myself one final gift. I'm going to send myself back to the early 1900s. I'm currently collecting vintage cash and more gold, things I couldn't get in my time anymore, to start a new life back then. I'm going to go see the Barbary lion and Tasmanian tiger and all the other long extinct animals. I'm going to go to the Cannes Film Festival in 1956 and shake the hand of Jacques Cousteau, see his amazing film win that award. I'm going to take many oceanic crossing trips on the ocean liners, and I'm going to do much more. Since the life extension and age reversal therapies will last for another 480 years before wearing off. And all the while I'll be preparing myself, mentally, emotionally, and physically, for the horrific act which I must do, to help keep humanity, to keep everything from ending. So all of you, along with your children, grandchildren, and so on, can live long, happy lives for as long as you want. I already wake up screaming almost every night from the horror I saw the last day in the 24th century. I know I likely will scream worse after I do this, but it must be done. I'm only staying here another few weeks, just to take in a final look at a time I'd almost forgotten about. So please, wish me luck, as morbid as that might be. I do need to warn you of one thing, though. One thing which both worries and scares me far more than any fictional monster or slasher ever could. There is one element of time travel which has been hypothesized, but never proven. One that, even after traveling through time, I don't know about. The theory of the multiverse. If someone were to travel back in time and alter the course of history in any large way, it's theorized that instead of the timeline they're on changing with it, a new branching timeline will emerge. One where the change occurs, while the other one continues on exactly as it originally did. The person who made the change would never know that they were on the new branching timeline. They couldn't. I pray to God, one which I still believe in, but so many in my time stopped believing in long ago, that the multiverse theory is wrong. That when I do this, I'll change this universe's fate, this timeline. But if it's right, I'm so sorry for what is to come. I found a journal washed ashore at a beach. What I read will give me nightmares for the rest of my life. I'm someone who loves to take long walks on the beach in the early mornings when very little to nobody else is there. The sea spray on my face and the salt air in my nostrils always help make the 8-hour shifts I spend behind a desk somewhat tolerable, and the sight of the sun rising out on the misty waves has always filled me with a sense of calm. However, that changed yesterday when I was out for my walk. It was a slightly rougher day. The waves were crashing on the shore a bit harder than normal, and the wind was whipping something fierce. As I strode across the beach, I noticed something out of place being pummeled around in the surf like it was a pinball. When I drew closer, I saw it was a plastic bag which had been sealed with duct tape at the top. Inside was what looked like a book of some sort, and driven by curiosity, I waded into the waves up to my ankles to retrieve it. When I got back to my car, I managed to open the bag and found that the book was actually someone's journal, as stated by the inscription on the inside of the cover. It declared it belonged to a man named Anthony Hodgson, as part of an ocean-crossing sailing ship from almost 20 years ago. As I was late for work, I didn't read any more of it, and instead tucked it into my briefcase for safekeeping. I figured I could find out more information later on that night and try and return it to its rightful owner. When I got home that night, I immediately took the journal out and began reading excitedly. However, as I got further and further towards the last entry, my intrigue and excitement crumbled to dust, and it was replaced by some of the strongest dread and horror that I have ever felt. I wasn't sure what to do with it once I finished reading. There's not much I can do. I can't send it to anyone, and if I turn it over to any newspaper or TV station, I'm sure it'd be dismissed as a hoax. Finally, I decided that the only place I could come to share it would be here, as I know many others come to share what they've seen and found. Let me know what you guys' thoughts are on this, but for me personally, what I've read has given me some of the worst nightmares I've had since I was a child, and will probably keep me out of the ocean forever. Here are the entries. July 15th, 2004, 3:34 p.m. Well, here we are, journal. Today is the day I've been dreaming about for most of my life. Ever since I was a little child, spending time at my aunt's and uncle's house in Maine, reading their old sailing magazines, I've always had the desire to make an oceanic crossing, using nothing more than my skill, knowledge, and determination to get me to the other side. After almost 30 years of waiting, it's now finally my turn, and thanks in no small part to the group of friends I've forged in this journey called life. All in total, there are 6 of us who will be making this trip. Myself, Daryl, Xander, Winston, Holly, and Anastasia. It was Xander's idea for us to begin saving and pulling together our money to purchase a sailboat over 12 years ago, and now I sit in my cabin on what took what seemed like an eternity to attain. Her name is the Lunging Leon, a 52-foot Sparkman and Stevens yawl from 1950, and God is she one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And for something almost 55 years old, she looks as good as the day she first entered the water. We're currently docked at a pier in Boston, and I can hear the others loading the final crates of supplies and barrels of diesel fuel on board. Tomorrow we will sail at the crack of dawn from here, with our bow squarely aimed for none other than jolly old England. I've done the calculations, and if we can average between 10 to 15 knots with the wind, it should be no more than a week and change to make it there. Almost 3,000 nautical miles of the Atlantic lie between us and the end of a journey that we will remember for the rest of our lives. I would love to keep writing, maybe even wax a bit poetic about this undertaking, but I can hear the others calling me to help them, so this is where I have to end this entry. For a first one, and as someone who's never written one of these things, I don't think it was that bad. Write later. July 16th, 2004, 11:17 a.m. Good morning, journal. We are officially on our way. We woke up just a little after 6 in the morning, and after a last few consultations of our charts and farewells with the harbor master, we cast off our lines and used the diesel engine to motor us out of Boston Harbor. Once we were clear of the last marker buoy, we killed it and opened up the sails. I'm happy to report that the second they did, the wind blowing from the west caught them, and we shot off like a bullet from a gun. Currently, according to the readout, we're sailing along at a pleasant 9 knots. Not what we were hoping for, but still adequate. I do have to say, though, there is an extreme almost sense of peace already. Boston and all the rest of the land is slowly but steadily turning into just a thin line behind us. And with the Lunging Leon on their only sail power, the only sounds that can be heard are the creaking of the boat's wooden hull as she slices through the water, the sails, and the rigging as they are slapped by the wind, and the cries of the seabirds as they follow us out to sea. And, of course, the shouts and laughs of my friends and I. Everyone's spirits are at a crescendo as the object of many late-night conversations turns from the stuff of drunken speculation to reality. I should point out that everyone on board has a job to do. Daryl and Winston are the two with the most practical knowledge in sailing, as they've actually sailed from Washington State down to Baja 4 or 5 years ago as a part of a competition. They'll serve as the captain and the navigator for our trip. Thank God for them, or we'd be in way over our heads here. Xander and myself have some knowledge, but only for small trips, usually from Portsmouth up to Bar Harbor in Maine, so we are to help with piloting, while Holly and Anastasia will be working the rigging, raising and lowering the sail as needed, with our help, of course. Additionally, Anastasia will be serving as our cook for the duration of our trip, and considering some meals she's made, I am all for that. I just took a look at the depth finder mounted just beside the main hatch in the cockpit. According to it, the bottom is already over 3,000 feet below us. I know many other people might find such a revelation scary, but as someone who's loved the sea as long as I can remember, it's thrilling. I can only imagine what strange and wonderful creatures swim and float beneath us, in the dark and cold waters, listening to the sounds of our hull creaking, reverberating for miles away as sounds travel farther in water than air. Daryl just asked me to take over the helm for a while, so I'll end this entry here. Write again soon. July 18th, 2004, 1:37 p.m. Well, I can't exactly say good afternoon, as things aren't as smooth sailing, pardon the pun, as I would have liked. You see, we've come across a rather large fog bank, which almost seems to have risen up from the waves and ensnared all in its reach, ourselves included. You can't even see 20 feet in any direction, and whenever a sound is made, it tends to bounce off the fog back to you in a rather sharp echo. We've had to pull some sails down and reduce our speed to 6 knots to be safe. To tell you the truth, Journal, it's really rather eerie. It almost feels like the entire world has been swallowed up and disappeared, and we're all that's left. Thankfully, though, Winston told me that he's seen fog like this before and that it won't last longer than a few hours. I'm grateful for that, honestly. If it lasted longer, I feel it might pull on my sanity a little. The magazine articles and photos never showed or spoke about this, and I wish they would. It wouldn't have changed my mind on this trip, but it would have prepared me for what to expect. Something loud just splashed out in the gloom. None of us could see what caused it, but everyone topside heard it. It was only a single splash, one which echoed like the crack of a gunshot in the fog. When I asked Daryl what it could have been, he shrugged his shoulders. "It could be anything, Tony," he said. "Lots of things splash around in deep water. Could be a whale breaching, could be a shark going after a school of fish. Hell, it could even be a piece of flotsam getting tossed about by a particularly tall whitecap." The explanation brought me more comfort instead of a sense of unease about the unknown. My mind is now filled with natural explanations. According to the radar, we are about 400 miles off the coast of the US, and the depth sounder shows the bottom has dropped away to 6,000 feet. We all need to keep a sharp eye out, so I'll stop writing for now to help the others. Write again soon. July 19th, 2004, 1:17 a.m. What the actual fuck just happened? Not even 4 hours ago, myself, Xander, and Holly laid down to get some sleep, as we've worked out a schedule where we sleep 3 at a time, changing out during the night to allow the other team to rest. I just managed to drift off when I flew out of my bunk onto the floor. It literally felt as if the boat had slammed into another vessel. For a moment, that was my biggest fear, and after checking on the two down below me, we both had slight bruises from their own unexpected flights. I dashed topside to the sound of the chaos. Winston and Daryl were shouting back and forth to each other in confusion, and I could hear Anastasia moaning somewhere closer to the bow. When I asked what had happened, they told me they didn't know. It was like we sailed straight into a damn block of concrete, Winston exclaimed to me. When I went to check on Anastasia, I found her lying on her back on the deck. She'd cracked her head on the main mast, giving her a rather nasty bump on her left temple, and received a cut on her cheek. The three of us carried her down below and laid her down in the forward berth, where Holly is looking after her. She says she'll be okay, but she needs to rest for the rest of the night. I, for the life of me, can't understand what we hit. It could have been a whale or a larger piece of wood, but nobody saw anything. And it was a perfectly clear night. Something that Daryl tells me will end the night after tomorrow, as a storm is coming our way. And I'm fairly certain that the two most experienced of our crew wouldn't jeopardize us so carelessly. If they say they didn't see anything, then I believe them. I've gone back down below to try and catch at least an hour's more rest before I help take over the late nights to early morning shift at the helm. According to the charts and radar, we're now about 850 miles off the coast, though I didn't look at the depth sounder this time. One additional thing to note, that may not have any meaning, but I'm still going to write it down. There was one strange thing I noticed when I went topside and went to help Anastasia. There was a rather putrid scent in the air, something I couldn't place. If I didn't know any better, I would have said it was ammonia, but we have none aboard which could have spilled, so I don't know what to make of it. Probably nothing, but still noting. Anyways, good night. Hopefully no more surprises. July 20th, 2004, 4:37 p.m. Good morning, journal. Things happily seem to be more on track today than they have been the last two. I'm currently sitting behind the helm, using my foot to keep it straight as I write. Most of the others have gone below to have dinner, which I'll have myself when they're finished. Someone needs to steer, after all. I am happy to report that Anastasia is back up and, aside from the bump on her head, seems to be in good spirits. She's currently making clam chowder, a favorite of all of ours. We've picked speed back up to about 11 to 12 knots with a strong tailwind, although earlier it died, causing us to have to tag back and forth before regrettably having to fire up the engine to carry us a bit farther. The sound of it was almost heresy out here in the silence, only broken by the wind and the waves. It was worth it though, as I saw a truly amazing sight about a half hour ago. A sperm whale. It breached out of the water not more than half a mile away from us. Seeing that gigantic black leviathan leaping from the waves is a sight that filled me with joy, to tell you. It did so a few more times, seeming to move around in a circle, before disappearing below the waves. I've honestly never heard a sperm whale doing multiple breaches in such a short succession, but there's a first for everything, I guess. Anyways, I look ahead now, and in the distance I can see the storm clouds on the horizon, lightning occasionally flashing in the dark gray fluff. According to the report we got from a tanker on the ship's radio, it will be a bad one, meaning our initial plan to make it to England in just over a week is going to be extended to just about 2 weeks. Fine by me, as despite our setbacks and problems, I still am thoroughly enjoying this journey. Good lord, did that just startle me. I heard a loud splashing sound off our stern behind me and swung around. There was nothing there, but it was so close I swear I could feel the water droplets hitting me on the back of the neck. Anyways, Xander's coming up to take over helm duties, so it's time for me to head below and eat. According to the radar, we're now over 1,300 miles out to sea, close to the halfway mark of our trip. The depth sounder says 12,000 feet of water lie between us and the sea floor. Right later. July 21st, 2004, 7:18 a.m. I don't even know where to begin this entry. I'm honestly lost for words, both in my shock and my grief. I suppose there's no other way to put it other than bluntly. Holly's gone. Last night we sailed into the storm at just a little after 8. The waves and the wind became something fierce, something that I only read when reading novels like The Perfect Storm and The Old Man and the Sea. The waves crashed down on the deck with all the ferocity of a freight train, and the howling of the wind sounded like a banshee screaming into our ears. All of us, save for Anastasia, who was cleaning up dinner dishes in the galley, were topside to keep the lunging Leon straight and true. But the storm battered about our sailboat like it was a child's plaything in the bath. I don't know how big the swells became, but we would ride up one and almost drop in a 75 or 80-degree angle down into the trough before the next set. The lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the hell we'd sailed into like it was the middle of daytime. And then thunder boomed and rattled my eardrums. Daryl and I were at the helm, fighting to keep the rudder straight while the others were working the rigging and the sails. Holly was working the rigging underneath the mainsail when it happened. A sudden change of wind slammed into us from the port side, shifting the boat sideways. It also caused the boom to change direction suddenly, swinging across deck like a charging bull. Xander and Winston managed to duck under it, but Holly didn't. The huge wood and fiberglass projectile caught my friend on the side of the head and shoulders in its arc, and before anyone knew what was happening, she was gone, knocked over the railing and into the churning waves. For a moment as we panicked and looked around us, I thought I saw her in a flash of lightning, about 15 yards behind the boat, waving her arms and her mouth open in a scream as she bobbled in the waves, kept afloat by her life jacket. But when the next flash came, not even 4 seconds later, I saw nothing. We couldn't turn around in the storm, not unless we wanted to swamp ourselves and sink. We could do nothing but helplessly sail away from our friend. Xander hasn't been able to stop crying. Holly and he were an item, and losing his life partner has destroyed him in a way I can only imagine. The waves have lessened some since, but our boat has taken major damage. Both the radio and radar have been damaged in the storm, making any kind of call for help impossible, as well as knowing our exact location. To make matters worse, there seems to be something wrong with the propeller for the diesel engine, as when we discovered some tears in the mainsail, we lowered them to repair and continue under engine power. But though the engine roared, we didn't move at all. Daryl says he'll check it out once the storm lets up a little more. For now, all happiness of this trip has flooded out of all of us. Now it's marked by the loss of one of us. I just honestly want to get to England at this point. We'll write later. July 21st, 2004, 03:13 p.m. The storm finally abated enough for Daryl to check on the prop. As the waves petered out and we seemed to move into the eye of the storm, he donned a pair of flippers and a mask and jumped overboard to inspect it. When he popped his head above the waves, his face bore a look of confusion and worry. Treading water beside the boat, he told us that the prop had been sheared half off by something. The one remaining blade has been bent so that it couldn't turn anymore, but the rest was just gone. I remember his exact words. I've sailed for 15 years and have never seen something like that happen in open water. You usually have to run aground to do damage like that. Unnerved myself, I asked him to come back aboard. As he swam back to the swim ladder on the stern, I swear I saw something below the waves. A shape darker than the rest of the ocean, one that seemed to move on its own power, slowly rising up towards us. Whatever it was, it looked big. I fully admit when I saw that dark shape, I couldn't help but reach over the transom and grab Daryl by the arm, almost wrenching him out of the water. It's beyond ridiculous, I know, but given our recent events, I feel on edge. Hell, we all do. Now I sit behind the helm in the cockpit as I watch Anastasia and Xander try and sew up the torn sails. I hope they'll do good progress soon. I want to be out of this area before nightfall. And more unnerving is the fact that the ammonia-like smell is back. This time, Winston smelled it as well, holding his nose and complaining about that god-awful stench. We looked around but saw nothing. I'm beginning to regret being the one who thought this trip of ours up over a decade and a half ago. Right later. July 21st, 2004, 06:13 p.m. Daryl's gone. What the fuck? What the actual fuck is going on? Just before dusk fell, he came back topside, in one arm holding a waterproof flashlight and the other a brand new propeller. He told us he brought a spare along in case of any emergency, and we felt a wave of relief wash over us that we'd be able to get moving. The storm wall was fast approaching, and Xander and Anastasia hadn't finished mending the sails yet. He also had a yellow pony bottle, which he pushed the regulator of into his mouth, and after picking up a wrench, put on his flippers and mask and slipped back overboard. We all saw his light click on, and he slipped out of sight underneath the boat. Every couple of seconds, we saw a burst of bubbles break the surface as he breathed out, and a quick flash of his flashlight swing around. For a few minutes, we felt the tension ease up, and despite the grim mood from Holly's death, Winston told us a joke about sharks and a razor-lined surfboard which made us laugh a bit. But then the jovial mood deflated as quickly as a bully popping a kid's party balloon. "Hey, what's going on?" we all heard Anastasia cry, and we looked over the railing down into the water. Daryl's light was dancing about as if he was turning rapidly around from one side to the other, the air bubbles coming in faster streams. Then two things happened in rapid succession. The first was the beam from his light disappeared. It was as if he just snapped it off. 1 second it was there whipping around, the next it was gone. And the second was that a huge stream of bubbles came to the surface at once. It was only for a second, and then nothing. We waited and waited, the seconds drawing into minutes. But our friend and one of our 2 leaders never resurfaced. It was as if he'd never even been there. We debated for a few minutes about having someone else go into the water, and after many refusals, I finally relented and grabbed a mask. I wouldn't be going in all the way, though. I would just drop down the swim ladder enough to see under the boat, and that was it. As I stepped down and felt the freezing water touch my feet, I felt the goose pimples rise all over my arms and legs. I couldn't understand why, but I felt my primal flight or fight instincts kicking in as I stuck my head in the water and shone another flashlight around. I saw no sign of him. The water under the boat was completely empty of life. No fish, no sharks, nothing, and no Daryl. I swung my head around, looking off into the gathering gloom, but still saw nothing. As I turned and looked down into the depths, however, I swear I saw a flash of changing color. It could have been a trick of the ocean, but I swear I saw one patch turn from dark blue, almost black, to very dark maroon. That was enough to make me yank my head out of the water and climb back up from the swim platform. "He's not there," I said to the others. "He's just disappeared." We all agreed then that nobody else would enter the water. We'd take our chances being battered around by the storm. Currently, we've started the bilge pumps before it reaches us. I can hear them roaring away in the recesses of the hall as I sit at the galley table and write this. And I can't help but feel a creeping sense of dread as I close my eyes and recall that dark shape I thought I saw, plus the changing color I swear I saw in the deep. But I can't let myself lose my cool. We all need to keep a level head if we hope to get back to dry land. I'll write again soon. I hope to God it's with better news. July 23rd, 2004, 2:30 a.m. If you gaze too long into the abyss, you'll find the abyss also gazes back at you. That may not be the exact quote, but who gives a damn? Not when you've looked into the eye of a monster. Still, I should tell what happened. The storm reached us that night. And all throughout it and much of the next day, we were battered by it. I thought so many times that the wooden hull would break apart, dropping us all into the monstrous waves and stinging rain. But somehow, she stayed afloat. It's true what they say, they don't make them like this anymore. As daylight broke, though, the storm increased in its ferocity, and we were forced to venture topside to steer the boat into the waves to keep from capsizing. Myself, Xander, and Winston went up after donning life jackets. We told Anastasia to stay below for her own safety. When we emerged, it was like stepping directly into hell. The rain tore at our faces, and the wind almost completely drowned out the sound of our voices. Lightning pierced the dark, and we worked with our remaining flashlights to raise what little sails we had whole, and then began to try to steer towards what our compasses and charts indicated was England. We had no idea how far we were from it, or how blown off course the storm has shoved us, but we had to try. For 3 hours we were battered and beaten, but we seemed to make headway. That was when a familiar sensation struck our boat. The same concrete slamming sensation as before, making it feel as if we'd come to a dead stop in the waves, which began to wash hard down into the cockpit. Thankfully, the main hatch was closed, so no water got down below. "What the hell did we hit?" I heard Winston shout, to be heard over the howling wind. "Hell if I know," Xander called back to him, and I saw his flashlight beam shine down into the water. "I don't see—" His voice cut off. "You don't see what?" Winston yelled back, but there was no answer from him. Feeling a piercing fear seize me, I shone my own flashlight up to where he's been, near the bow. It illuminated him, still kneeling and clutching at the railing, staring down into the sea. "Xander, what the hell is the matter with you?" I screamed as loud as I could. Slowly, he turned to look up and back at me. What I saw made me feel as if the blood in my veins had been replaced with ice. I have never seen Xander even a tiny bit afraid before. We always said he was the most courageous out of our group, but now his face turned a shade of pale I only thought corpses could hold. And his eyes were about as wide as they could get. His hand holding his flashlight trembled. As I looked, I smelled that putrid stench once more. This time, though, it was overpowering. That's when I heard Winston scream. I swung my beam back portside, and the beam, oh, good God Almighty, the beam landed on a scene that, however much longer I am alive, I'll see whenever I close my eyes. Winston was still there, but so was something else. Something which had come from the sea itself. My hand trembles as I write this next part. It was a fucking tentacle, an honest-to-God tentacle, looking like something out of the old 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea movie from the 50s. But unlike that, this was very much alive. I saw every detail in slow motion. The giant club of the tentacle, big enough to wrap around the mast and filled with dozens of huge white suckers. The arm of the tentacle as thick as two men standing next to each other. It all was a dark maroon color. And then I saw Winston. The tentacle had wrapped around my friend with the strength of 7 boa constrictors. Squeezing him so tightly, I saw his face turn red, even in the biting wind and rain. He feebly pressed his hands to it, trying in vain to push it away. And then, as quick as one of the bolts of lightning flashing overhead, he was gone. It was so quick I only saw it as a blur, hearing a gigantic splash as he was yanked below the waves. I forgot all about steering the boat and scrambled from the side in some misguided and foolish attempt to save him. I shone the light's beam down into the darkness, and fuck me running, do I wish I hadn't, because it shone directly into an eye. An inhuman eye the size of a wall clock, one which looked back at me with a cold and predatory gaze. The pupil contracted in the light, and it shot back underneath the boat, to the other side. "Xander, I turned to scream for my other friend to get away from the railing, but he was already gone. I hadn't even heard him get taken over the wind and the rain. His flashlight rolled around the deck near where he'd been kneeling, but he was gone. That's when I saw another tentacle rise above the railing a few feet in front of me. It felt around the deck, seeming to move by a sense of touch as it searched for its next meal. For me. All courage left me, and I abandoned anything topside and dashed below. I slammed the hatch closed behind me and locked it, knowing full well if it really wanted to, the tentacles could easily rip it off its track. Anastasia was shaking when I ducked down below and saw her. She'd been looking through the side windows and seen what had happened to the other two. To Winston, her husband. As much as I was terrified, I went to her. I held her in my arms to console her, and we sat there, sitting on the hardwood floor, listening to the sickening sounds of the tentacles moving underneath us over the hull and breaching the waves to search the deck. After a while it stopped. The storm lessened a little, the waves ceasing their merciless battering of our boat. Anastasia finally drifted off to sleep in my arms, and I carried her to the forward berth. She needs sleep. So do I, but I can't bring myself to fall asleep. I know I'll be hunted by nightmares of that tentacle and I know it's still there. I can still smell that ammonia scent, even through the closed windows and hatch. For now, though, I'll just curl up on the galley seats. I don't know what else to do. There's nothing else I can do. Who gives a fuck about the date? This will be my final entry in this journal. I don't even know how many days we've drifted aimlessly on the waves anymore. The storms finally passed and the waves have remained relatively calm ever since. If it weren't for knowing what lies beneath them, I might almost call it peaceful. It's anything but, though. Our food and fresh water is almost completely used up. All our remaining sails tore in the storm, and Anastasia is in no shape to sew them up. And unfortunately, I never learned how. It wouldn't matter anyways. Our rudder is gone. I know because when I opened the main hatch and stuck my head out, I saw it floating on its side about a mile away from us. No doubt torn off by that creature, leaving us completely dead in the water. I know what it is now. I was too terrified and confused to put together the pieces in my mind, but now, all the marine biology knowledge in my brain has allowed me to identify it. Archichurus dux, a giant squid, one far larger than has been seen by scientists before. At least 60 or 70 feet long, judging by the size of the eye I saw. A creature that has for centuries terrorized sailors, giving rise to the legend of the Kraken, pulling ships below the waves and preying upon the floating sailors. So many marine biologists and historians said that the stories of ships being pulled down to their doom were conjecture, wives' tales. I can confidently say that they are absolutely full of shit. The stories were right on the money. The lunging Leon is slowly sinking. The pumps gave out yesterday. Both Anastasia and I heard them die. When I went topside to check on them, looking around as if I were a fucking owl to make sure I wouldn't be grabbed, and lifted the hatch to the engine compartment, I saw water in it. For a while we tried bailing it out, but soon gave up. What's the point anyways? We can't call for help. We can't escape in the dinghy lashed on the deck, as we'd be set upon by the beast. That damned smell is always here now, one that signals its presence, along with the scrapes of its tentacles across the hull. We're fucked any way we look at it. And this morning, Anastasia stepped overboard. I don't think she could take the waiting anymore. I awoke just in time to see it. She'd become closed off since the day before, barely saying a word. I couldn't make out what she was thinking, but I awoke and saw the hatch to the cockpit was open. Feeling a new sense of dread course through my veins, I ran to open the hatch. just in time to see her step off the stern railing. I heard the splash of her dropping into the water. The sound of the tentacles rubbing on the hull stopped. And then nothing. Silence. I'm alone now. Well, not completely alone. That fucking thing is still there. The rubbing and scraping has started again. As I write this, the boat has sunk lower into the water. The entire transom is almost underwater, and as it bobs up and down in the waves, I can see it, sitting just below the surface behind the boat and waiting patiently, staring at me with that cold, unblinking eye. It knows as well as I do that I don't have long, which is why I'm going to place this journal into a bag after I'm finished writing this. I'll seal it with a roll of duct tape which floats around near my feet, and then I'll throw it overboard, as far away as I can. Maybe with some luck it'll wash ashore somewhere, so someone can know what happened to us. The transom is lower in the water now, and the tentacles are beginning to reach over into the cockpit. I'm going to stuff myself into the forward berth as far as I can, and shut the cabin door. If I'm lucky, maybe I'll drown before it can reach me. I don't want to be torn apart by that monster's beak, like the others were. Please, whatever you do, beware the open ocean. Monsters, real ones, dwell out here. Goodbye. I found a bunker of a prepper family who went missing 3 years ago. Dr. Daniel Vance was a smart man. Too smart for his own good, maybe. 40 years old, a lecturer in fluid dynamics with a mind made of shapes and numbers. No one knows why, but one day, on a whim, he crunched the numbers on the apocalypse and came to a troubling conclusion. He didn't share exactly what it was he'd deduced, but given that he immediately quit his job and liquidated many of his assets, it's fair to say it wasn't positive. Swept up in the wake of this tremendous upheaval was his wife, a 24-year-old PhD student who'd had grown infatuated with Daniel some time before. She loved the strange bear of a man who could just as easily build a log cabin as he could explain the idiosyncrasies of an asteroid's orbit. Speaking to Daniel always left you with the profound impression he was right. So when he told her what he wanted to do, she agreed. 15 years and 5 children later, the Vances were living in the distant woods just beyond my hometown. They were enigmatic, richer than the Pope, and extremely serious about their prepper lifestyle. But they were also funny, easygoing, and incredibly compelling to speak to. Larger-than-life survivalists who swept into town with bizarre requests that thrilled local businesses. Vast quantities of cement, iron, lead, and steel were all shipped through the remote mountains so that the Vances could build their shelter. The advanced methods they used to keep it secret were legendary. Daniel had once spent 6 months earning the license necessary to drive HGVs up to his compound so that no one else would lay eyes on it. And on one occasion when a company had refused his request for a GPS tracker-free vehicle, he bought them out wholesale, so they had no choice. So when they stopped appearing in town during the pandemic, when requests for food and goods stopped and all contact was dropped, most attributed it to lockdown. They had a bunker and had spent their entire lives training to be self-sufficient in the face of civilization's collapse. Even Alexander, the youngest at just 3, was already collecting firewood as a chore and learning what local plants were edible. Most of us just assumed that if anyone could ride out COVID without breaking a sweat, it would be the Vances. The reality turned out to be something else. When the worst came to light, we discovered that Daniel had used the pandemic as an excuse for a dry run. The family intended to spend 6 months in lockdown and essentially beta test their fallout bunker. 3 months in, and the sheriff received a distress call on the radio. Coordinates were provided by the hushed voice of a sobbing child that most assume was Alexander, even though that's never been proven. The police arrived and found the bunker still sealed. It took hours for emergency responders to cut into the door. All the while, efforts were made to contact the family within, but to no avail. Once inside, police were left dumbfounded. There was no one to be rescued. No bodies. No survivors. There was evidence the door's locking mechanism had failed and trapped the Vances inside with no way out. But if so, where had they gone? Beds and cots lay everywhere with moldering yellow sheets, buckets close to hand with stains all around them. Some doors were barred, others smashed to pieces. There was even evidence of makeshift quarantines and, in places, what looked like violence. The police, usually a fantastic source of gossip, were not forthcoming until the town demanded answers, and the sheriff was forced to offer only the barest of outlines. An outbreak of waterborne illness had struck the Vances down not long after they were locked inside and unable to seek help. Rumors of contagion were overstated, fueled by the unrelated rise of COVID. Whatever contamination had killed the Vances, it was non-organic in nature. No need to panic. The Vances' loved ones had been notified. The bunker was going to be demolished, and we could all put this terrible tragedy behind us. Of course, we still had questions. 1,000 of them. Why hadn't the family called for help? They had radios, computers, smartphones too. They were survivalists, not Amish. And where were they? What had happened to their bodies? Why hadn't they simply left? We shouted these and more at the town meeting, but the police simply refused to comment. For most of us, the excitement lasted another week or two until we realized we weren't getting answers anytime soon. Besides, the pandemic was in full swing and most of us had other things to worry about. The tragic story eventually faded until it was just one of those awful things in the town's history that we didn't talk about. I was as guilty as anyone else of just forgetting about it. I certainly never expected to find the bunker out there in the woods. Faded police tape still on the door that hung wide open, with scorch marks around the lock. It stood out in the woods like someone had cut a hole right in the fabric of reality. The darkness so deep and black, it almost ached to look at. The sight of it made my heart drop into my stomach. It radiated pain. Does that make sense? I think some part of my lizard brain picked out details that wouldn't become apparent to me until I got closer, like the bloody finger streaks that stained the handle from where someone had scrabbled furiously at the lock without success, and the tiny viewing window that had been smashed with a hammer that still lay nearby. I needed only to glimpse it to imagine the family taking turns to stand there and scream into the woods, desperate for rescue. Under any other circumstances, I would have run. But I'd gone there looking for my dog, and my light revealed a few wet paw prints making their way down the dusty concrete tunnel. Half Bernese and half collie, Ripley is the sort of dog who trembles in my arms when a storm buffets the windows and needs his paws held when we brush him. I love him. I do not have much of a family, or a wife, or even many friends, but I have Ripley. and I could no more have turned around and gone home to an empty apartment where I would have to sob my grief away than I could flap my arms and fly. He was my dog, and I'd raised him since he was a puppy, and I wasn't going to leave him out in those woods. I went in after him. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew it wouldn't be good. Whatever the police had found, they'd not only kept most of the morbid details to themselves, they had also lied. The bunker was not demolished, or even sealed off. In fact, looking at the occasional blue latex glove tossed aside, and the one or two broken police issue flashlights, it seemed like the last people inside had been in a hurry to get out. Given this was where 7 people had presumably died, I assumed it was someone's job to clean it all up. But the corridor looked largely untouched. Just a few meters in, and manic writing started to cover the walls. The desperate scrawls of a lone survivor, left there to be rediscovered like cave paintings. Most were deliberations on how to get out. Diagrams, blueprints, equations, and formulae, all focused on the door and the circuits responsible for its faulty lock. I instinctively assumed that they belonged to Daniel and that he'd been the last to die. What a god-awful fate for a man to outlive his children. And yet it got worse. Slowly, the writing changed from equations and plans to a desperate scrawl. The same few phrases repeated over and over. 5 doors. 5, not 6. 6. Didn't make it. Didn't make it. 6 doors. 6. It seemed like the kind of thing you'd find in an asylum. A psychotic rambling punctuated only by 6 paragraphs, right at the end. Each letter was impeccably neat, and each small paragraph was topped with a beautifully drawn Christian cross. Elliot Vance, aged 15, a gifted guitarist. He liked boys, even though he thought I did not know. I loved them with everything I had. He would have made a great man. Alicia Vance, aged 14. She liked to paint and to shoot. She had her mother's mean streak. It would have served her well in the future. Elijah Vance, aged 8, but the smartest of us all. These were Daniel's memorials to his family, and seeing the words lit up by my torch was a haunting insight into the overwhelming despair he'd endured. He must have realized he wouldn't get a chance to speak at his family's funerals or to write their obituaries. This was his last desperate way of making sure the world might one day know them as he did, as real people. The words marked the end of the tunnel, standing adjacent to a trap door in the ground. It was not open, but the tunnel came to a dead end immediately afterwards, and Ripley's prints disappeared at the hatch. I feared he might be in danger, but still I stopped and looked at the bunker door 20 meters behind me. The once gloomy forest looked so bright, even on this cloudy day. The air dotted with rain. A part of me felt like I was leaving the whole world behind as I began to climb the ladder down. I entered a large circular living space that was packed with furniture and little nooks and crannies. The walls were covered with folding beds and tables, and every inch was multifunctional. A dining space could become a sitting space, which in turn might be where someone slept, or even exercised. It all depended on what particular bit of furniture you unfolded, or unclipped or unfurled. 7 people in close quarters, nowhere near enough privacy. It made sense they went with this cluttered overlapping use of space. But it was still a large room, bigger than most studio apartments, and there were a few corridors that led deeper into the earth telling me the bunker had unseen depths. I looked for some sign of my dog and soon found his trail, but this far from the rainy copse, Ripley's prints were starting to fade. After barely a few meters, they petered out vaguely in the direction of a nearby door. I wanted to follow, but stopped myself from rushing onward. It was unlikely Ripley was getting out any other way, and I'd do us no good getting myself hurt. I decided to take a look around and quickly spotted a dinner table. If I needed proof the police had not bothered with a cleanup, this was it. The plates were still out, the food rotten to a strange blackened husk. A child's hat lay across one place setting. The once creamy fleece turned a sickly green and yellow. The chairs had their backs reinforced with wooden beams, fitted with long grooves, so that something the width of a nail could slide into them. And on each of the cushions were foul-smelling stains that looked oddly like an ass print. I touched one with gloved hands, and the material crackled audibly. Whatever it was, similar stains were on the cutlery and plates, and there were even handprints of it placed firmly on the tablecloth. At first I thought it was blood, but that wasn't quite right. It was too contained to be from leaking blood. On the back of one of the chairs, a stain tapered exactly where the woman's waist would be, like a near-perfect silhouette. I shivered as I remembered that Miranda Vance had always been a slim woman, and wondered how she had left her imprint on the gray fabric. Using my torch, I saw these stains repeated in the oddest of places. Yes, there were some on beds and blankets, and even patches of plain floor exactly like you might expect in a room full of sick people. But why did one stain on the floor bear such a wrong resemblance to a child, huddled in a fetal position? And why was the same stuff all over the TV remote, and on books on shelves, and board games too? Everything from sofa cushions to DVD boxes to piles of dirty laundry were covered in the same dried brownish material that gave off a foul, coppery miasma. I found the jigsaw particularly baffling. Someone had set up another table with 4 chairs, all modified with the same back supports as those by the dinner table, and a jigsaw had been lain out with 4 separate piles, but only one was depleted. The rest looked largely untouched, almost like someone had portioned out pieces for 3 other people who had absolutely no interest in going along with it. Maybe Daniel had tried to keep up morale while the family were sick. God help me, if that were true, I couldn't help but imagine the poor man sat there with his loved ones close to death, desperately trying to encourage them to click their own pieces into place while they faded in and out of consciousness. Something about that room emanates madness, and the longer I stayed down there, flicking the bright disk of light of my torch from one detail to another, the more I wanted to leave. One door had wooden beams nailed across it. One sofa had been partially disassembled, multiple beds had been burned, and all the light bulbs had been removed and put in a box on the kitchen countertop. Looking up at the ceiling, I finally had some insight into why the police were so confident the Vances had not survived, despite never finding their bodies. Someone had jammed a human finger into one of the empty sockets, almost like they expected it to glow with a flick of a switch. What was it about this place that had caused the police to leave and never return? Not to even take that finger and test it for signs of illness, or even just to confirm who it belonged to. I decided it was time to hurry up and find my dog. People had died in that place, and while I'm not superstitious, I can't be the only skeptic who has done the calculations in his head and realized it costs nothing to be respectful of ghosts. That bunker was cramped, terrifying, and the air stank so bad I started to worry I'd get sick myself. It served no one any good to linger, but I'd be damned if I'd just walk away and leave Ripley to rot down there. It's not like he could climb a ladder and get out of his own, even if I wasn't entirely sure how he'd gotten down there in the first place. Summoning what little bravery I had left, I called out and broke the silence, something which felt like a terrible taboo in that god-awful place, like screaming in a graveyard. "Ripley!" I waited and hoped to hell I'd hear the pitter-patter of his paws, but for the longest of moments there was only the kind of silence that makes you wonder if someone or something in the darkness is holding its breath, trying to look like just another patch of nothing, biding its time until you finally turn around and show it your back. The TV came on with a blurt of white noise that was so loud and so sudden I cried, threw my arms up, and nearly fell backwards onto a rolled-out sleeping bag that looked like it had spent a week in the sewer. By the time I realized what had caused the noise, I could already hear a tinny rendition of Daniel Vance's voice. "I realize the issue here. I need to emphasize just how little I understand anything that's..." I frowned at the screen as I approached. It showed a greenish infrared view of the bunker with Daniel up front and the dinner table behind him. It was grainy and hard to see, but I could clearly tell that his family were sitting in those chairs. "Miranda was first to fall ill. Looking back, it makes perfect sense. Miranda often went into storage to fetch food for cooking, and we found it behind one of the refrigerators. So that's, shit." One of the figures in the background slumped onto the table with a loud clank and sent a plate spinning off onto the ground. Shit. Daniel muttered as he got up and grabbed the woman by the shoulders and sat her upright. "Miranda never did like my cooking." He snorted a laugh as he fussed with something at the back of the chair. "The rods are much better than the tape. All those hours spent taping them upright to the chairs never worked. But the rods, they fit right into the spine with a little modification. I can just slot them into the chairs. That way, everyone is able to join in for dinner. I'm working on something similar for family game night." Daniel wandered over to the camera, and with a grin he lifted it from the tripod and scanned the dinner table. What I saw nearly made me drop my torch. His family were long dead, gaunt faces, missing noses, lips that had receded to reveal awful grins. These were corpses, plain as day, even when viewed through such a low-resolution image. The only thing that made them seem remotely alive was the way their eyes still reflected the infrared back so that they glowed in the dark. And yet Daniel seemed oblivious to it all. He tousled Elliot's hair, kissed his wife on the cheek, run a hand across one young girl's shoulder. He even picked the young Alexander up from his high chair, and I assumed he coddled him. I don't know for sure, because I looked away, unwilling to see the poor boy up close. Eyes averted from the screen, I couldn't help but pan my torch across the same dinner table and shiver as I finally realized what all those stains were. Not quite blood, but close. Liquefying flesh. Left alone for months, Daniel had not put his family's bodies to rest. Instead, he had moved them around from place to place and puppeted them, living life as if nothing had really changed. Looking at where those stains had settled, I saw a clear pattern emerge. He had put them to bed. He had set them dinner. He had propped them up to watch TV or gave them their favorite books. They even sat there as lifeless husks while Daniel waited for them to complete a fucking jigsaw. The idea horrified me to my core. Back to work. It's obviously not part of the original designs. No room on the other side. Not on the blueprints. Elliot didn't believe me, and why would he? I made every inch of this place, but I did not install that door in storage on the bottom level. I checked the cameras and some of the photos I took during the build, and the wall is just blank. But the door is there now, and it must lead somewhere. I don't know when or why it opens, but it does, and the next time I'll be ready, because I have to know what's on the other side, and why it did this to us. Alone down here, often all asleep at once. Anything could have slit our throats and been done with it, but it didn't. It took its time, and I have to know why. It took our radios and computers and phones, one by one, none of us noticing until it was far too late. I kept telling the kids they needed to take better care of their things, and even as they complained, I just assumed the phones were lying behind some shelf. Where else could they go in a locked bunker? But it wasn't the children at all. Looking back, there are so many signs. Who kept taking away the lights? Who kept draining the batteries in our torches? How long did we live with it before we finally realized we weren't alone? Was it here, every step of the way? A door out of nothing that leads to nowhere, at least most of the time, because I know for a fact it does not always open onto a blank wall. I can hear it shuffling around in there, wet breath rattling in its lungs. A horrible sound I hear roaming these halls when it thinks I'm asleep. I listened to Daniel, fascinated by this strangely compelling rant, when movement caught my eye. An infrared camera running in the dark, its image a rolling mess of uniform noise. What was it seen? I paused the tape and rewound. Squinting, I saw two pinpricks of light in the darkness just over Daniel's shoulders. Slowly, the image resolved itself in my mind. I knew what I was seeing, and it turned my blood to ice. Miranda Vance had turned her head, and her lifeless eyes glowed as she fixated them on the back of Daniel's head. Not even any point leaving at this stage. I'm no doctor, but that door is giving off enough radiation to kill a family of 7. If none of us had touched it, being in the same room is risky, but not lethal. But given how sick we've become, it's pretty obvious our curiosity got the better of us, one by one, and we all got too close. Or maybe not. Maybe that thing on the other side came through and did this. I don't even... Wait, what was that? Daniel turned and the camera stopped recording. The image it froze on was of a lone man, bright as a star in the camera's lens, facing off against unknowable darkness, broken only by 6 pairs of wide, glowing eyes. I became painfully aware of my position relative to the table, and I had the painful premonition that if I turned, those chairs would not be empty. I would see the Vances, all of them, Daniel as well, waiting for me. Heads turned, bodies left to rot for years in the dark. Behind me something shifted. It breathed, loud, quick. I knew what it was. I knew. It came at me so fast that when I felt something hot and wet touch my hand, I screamed, only for the presence to suddenly recoil. But then, without hesitation, it leapt at me and bore me to the ground. I wept as Ripley licked my face. He was shivering and, worst of all, silent, which was not normal. He was not a quiet dog, not when greeting me and not when excited like he was now. But whatever he'd seen down there, he clung to me and dug his paws into my shoulders like he wanted to be cradled over the shoulder, something he has been too big to do for years. "Oh, you fucking idiot," I cooed in a soft whimper, and even in the dark, I could feel his tail wagging. Joking aside, I felt nothing but relief at finding him. "Let's get the hell out of here." I picked him up, straining a little under the weight but refusing to give in to tired muscles, and made for the ladder. It wasn't easy climbing the 3 or 4 rungs to the hatch, but I managed it and gave the hatch a shove. First 1 hand, then 2, again and again, with everything I had. But still, that hatch refused to budge. "Shit!" I cried while pounding at it with my fists, but all I achieved was a sore wrist. The hatch had jammed when, somehow, the handle had been snapped clean off. Now I'd need a pair of pliers or something to cut through the metal bar locking it shut. My fingers couldn't move it, nor could I brute force the hatch open. The metal bar was an inch thick and, at the very least, I'd need some tools to get at it from this side. At least it's fixable, I thought as I climbed back down and caught my breath. On one wall, I noticed a simple diagram of the bunker made in chalk. It had 3 floors. The bottom was storage. Daniel had mentioned that before. And I noticed that he had drawn through it with a large X. And the top floor was labeled quarters, where I stood now. But the middle floor was labeled workshops, and it was there I realized that I'd find what I needed. There was one door that opened onto a concrete stairwell, and standing at the top, I shone my light down the spiraling guardrails, unsure of what it was I hoped to see. There were only harsh shadows and the sense of something foul rising up on the air. A smell that tickled my throat and burned a little in my lungs. Had the police even gone this far? Had they seen what I'd seen on the TV and just left? Somehow I thought it was unlikely. That had been enough to send the entire sheriff's department running. So was it something else that had done it? Something that had been enough to terrify dozens of armed men? Something that was almost definitely down there? The door. I went down quietly. At first I considered leaving Ripley behind. But after losing him the first time, I decided I'd rather risk it just to know that he was right next to me. Besides, he was being quieter than I was, and I didn't feel much like going down those stairs on my own. He accompanied me with only the quiet click-clacks of his paws on concrete, a sound I found deeply comforting as I barely managed to keep my torch from shaking in my hand and my breathing steady. Down one floor, and I found the workshop exactly as you might expect. A large space filled with generators and fuel and water tanks and boilers, and heaters and pretty much anything and everything that you'd need to survive, but which you couldn't put outside due to fallout. Wires, pipes, and tubes ran from one end of the room to the other, and even years later, most of the machinery still hummed in the pitch-black emptiness. An idea I found deeply unsettling. Taking one look at the strange tangle of harsh shapes and industrial figures looming out on the walls and floor, I shivered and looked around, quickly finding a small area Daniel had cordoned off for his own use. About a fifth of the total floor space, there was a large workbench and some seriously high-end machining equipment, all very well used. Lathes, buzzsaws, drills, belt sanders, welding torches, everything a man needed to do it himself. And Daniel had been busy. I'm not exactly sure what it was he'd been working on, but there was an arm on the bench. It sat atop a pile of papers that had slowly turned brown over the years, until the whole thing looked like it had been soaked in tobacco spit. On the whiteboard was a faded but still visible diagram of what looked to me like a ball and socket joint. I thought of the tape, of Daniel's little mechanism to keep his family upright, and then looked at the arm and suppressed a momentary gag reflex. I don't know if Dan had been working on posable limbs, or just a way to put the decomposing remains back together after they'd started to fall apart, but the size of the arm suggested a preteen child, and he'd left it out on the surface like it was a disassembled clock. It was also missing a finger. Just how fucking crazy was he? I wondered as I pinched my nose with one hand and began overturning boxes, looking for a hefty pair of pliers, or maybe a hacksaw. Ripley backed away from the noise, but once I made sure he wasn't going anywhere, I carried on, grabbing and pulling at box after box, hoping I'd find what I was looking for. Anything to break that metal bar. In the end, I managed to get a pair of bolt cutters, a crowbar, and a heavy-duty pair of pliers. One went in my pocket, one went down the back of my jeans, and the other was clutched in my fist, too large to be tucked away in my clothes. The bolt cutters felt hefty in my hand, which was a bit of comfort. But that feeling didn't last long. Something moved in the darkness. Out there in the twisted jungle of shadows cast by all those pipes and wires that ran from one machine to the next, a figure moved. Thin, but unmistakably human in its outline. I couldn't help but remember what I'd seen on that tape. Surely it couldn't have been real. Maybe Daniel had rigged something up. Some fishing wire and a motor, maybe. The idea that those bodies had been moving on their own. I couldn't be sure of that, could I? It was a frightening idea, one my mind had latched onto out of sheer panic. That was all. And then I saw them. A pair of white pinpricks reflecting back at me from the depths of that cluttered room. Ripley, already behind me, head nuzzled into my leg, pushed even closer against me, and let out a barely audible whine under his breath. The behavior of a dog who was terrified, close to pissing himself with fear. Just a bit of metal, I told myself, as the light shook so violently in my hand, I struggled to see straight. Just two shiny bits of metal. They blinked and began to come towards me. If I had any doubts left, they were dispersed by the sight of a pale white hand emerging into the light. I ran straight to the stairs and went to climb them, but only 1 or 2 steps in and I saw something gripping the handrail on the top floor. A moldy clump of flesh only just recognizable as a fist. The flesh withered until the fingers were basically bone. Without meaning to, I brought my light up out of habit, and I saw the bloated face of a hairless corpse glaring down at me. I couldn't even tell you if it had been a teenage girl or a 60-year-old Daniel. Either way, I instinctively turned and found another body shambling towards me out of the workshop. I was trapped. Nowhere to go. By the feel of warm fluid on the back of my leg, I could tell Ripley had finally pissed himself. An adult dog tailed between his legs, shivering like a puppy and desperate to be picked up. God, I needed him to just stay together for a little longer. I couldn't take him in my arms, but I couldn't leave him behind either. With nowhere to go, I ran down and entered storage. There was the temptation to stop once I hit the bottom. Down here, the air was thicker and the sounds of my breathing were muted, somehow distant. But I only had to look back up to see 3 pairs of eyes glaring down at me. So without giving any of it much further thought, I barreled down the corridor and stumbled onto a door at random. Opening it, I saw what looked like your standard storage room, only most of the shelves had been overturned and the food left to rot on the floor. 1 or 2 shelving units were still upright though, and their shelves were covered in tall opaque boxes that made them a fantastic hiding spot. That, I decided, would have to be where I crouched down and turned off my light. I was already inside when I realized that wasn't all that was in there. The door almost looked normal. I could see why Daniel must have been confused by it, because it looked a little bit like all the other doors down there. But it was different too. It was too tall and too wide, about 1.5 feet off the ground, and the metal rusted in its entirety like it had been aged out of sync with everything else down there. All around the jamb was a profusion of wet, soppy moss, like the kind you find hanging off trees in a swamp, and every few seconds the door would leak something strange and oily, like the kind of thing you find in a parking lot on a rainy day. Of course, that wasn't too strange in itself, but the leak was horizontal, defying gravity so that every few seconds a large glob of the stuff would whip across the room and slap into the wall opposite, creating a puddle about the size of a man that defied all reason. Remembering Daniel's words about radiation, I instinctively inched away from this puddle and the door on the opposite wall, backing myself into the darkest, quietest corner I could, while I pulled Ripley behind me and hoped the hell he wouldn't give me away. Once I was in there, I turned off my light and waited. I must have taken longer than I thought to find a hiding spot because it was barely 2 seconds later when a few figures entered the room. It was pitch black after I turned off my torch, but they made enough noise to let me know that at least 2 of them had stumbled in after me. I stayed there, unable to see anything, not sure if they were heading straight for me or just getting ready to leave, forced to hold out and let luck decide my fate. When I finally heard something scrape against the wall barely 2 feet from where I stood, I gave up and switched my light on, desperate to know what was coming for me. The sound had been terribly misleading. Daniel Vance was no more than 6 inches from my face. "Get out," he hissed from a toothless and cracked mouth. A living corpse just like the others. Somehow a flash of intelligence remained in those wide, terrified eyes. And then I heard it, the creaking of a door, and without even thinking, I turned the light and saw it on the wall. I saw it open. And behind the strange steel, there was more than just plain old concrete. Much more. I saw a raging gullet of flesh, a ringed tube of pulsing muscle lined with teeth the size of hands, a spiraling descent into madness. Hot, fetid air washed into the room, buffeting me and the rotting corpses, all of us paralyzed by what we were seeing. Even if for most of the figures beside Daniel and myself, they didn't have eyes to see with. "What the fuck?" I muttered, unable to take my eyes from the flesh tube beyond the doorway. "It's coming," Daniel whispered as he grabbed me with one fist and hurled me out of the room. I hit the floor and skidded along a slick fluid left by the Vance's footprints, the smell of which turned my stomach. Perhaps the worst detail was that it was cold. I don't know why. I just expected whatever oozed off of them to be feverishly hot, but it wasn't. It soaked my shirt like I'd fallen into a muddy puddle. "It's coming." The voice wasn't Daniel's. I couldn't say for sure, but it sounded like a child's whisper. One by one, the bodies shuffled over to the open door and knelt before it. I don't know why, but I got the impression the others had pretty much lost everything left of their minds. But Daniel remained aware. He looked back at me once more and spoke before he pressed his head to the floor in supplication with the others. "The only thing we did wrong was being here for it to torture. I didn't need a reason, just an opportunity. Leave. It won't let us go. It won't even let us die. And if it catches you, it won't let you go either." His forehead kissed the dirt. And then something reached through the door and gripped his head in its palm the way you or I might pick up an apple. In full panic, I ran over and grabbed my dog and the bolt cutters, and I ran like my legs were pistons, machines whose signals of exhaustion and fatigue could not slow me down or cause me to fall. I had to move. I had to leave. The hand that had grabbed Daniel, the sight of it flushed my mind clean like some kind of enema. It hurt to see the image replay in my mind, but there was nothing else in my head echoing around except the sight of fingers with one too many knuckles and nails as large as a smartphone. I reached the top floor and nearly collapsed from breathlessness, but I wouldn't let myself stay down for long. I crawled over to the ladder and climbed up and immediately went to work trying to cut the metal lock. It was hell with just one hand, the other clinging to the torch that I kept frantically pointing at the door behind me. And it wasn't long before I fumbled one too many times and dropped my only source of light. No, 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 I mewed. But there was no time to look for it. I had to get out, and I had to get out fast. I couldn't see, but I was sure I could hear something climbing up those stairs. Not the steady thump of human feet. No, this was different. This was a rapid pitter-patter of a spider, maybe. Something with hundreds of feet or hands, or God knows what, skittering along the floor and walls and ceilings, pulling itself along with a body whose mere shape would offend God. Using all my strength, I leaned hard on the bolt cutters and, at last, the bolt gave way. I threw the latch open and got just enough ambient light to see Ripley hovering at the bottom of the ladder, growling ineffectually at the doorway. I crouched down, scooped him up, and fled up the ladder so quickly that my muscles turned to jelly at the top, and I fell over onto hands and knees. But still, I was out. The long corridor covered in writing was ahead of me, and at the very end, a doorway now capped by the tired blue light of a full moon. Ripley needed no encouragement. He whipped down the corridor with canine speed, and I followed at a broken and stumbling crawl, eventually shouldering past the open door and collapsing onto the forest floor. For a few seconds I drifted in and out of consciousness, but when I looked up and saw the canopy overhead moving, the branches backlit by the full moon, I snapped awake and glared down at something gripping my ankle. The hand had reached out of the dark and seized me and was slowly dragging me back into the earth below. Whatever it was, most of its body lurked out of sight in the shadows behind the doorway. But the hand that crushed my leg was the size of my torso, with an arm that looked like it belonged to a mole rat. I struck it with my own fist. I dug my nails in. I cried and kicked and screamed, but nothing could stop it. From behind the door, something like a face grinned and leered at me with joy. It was taking its time. Sure enough, pulling me in so slowly that it gave my mind all the time in the world to appreciate the nightmare that awaited me. I think if, in that moment, you'd given me a gun, I would have shot myself, because God help me I couldn't escape the look in Daniel's eyes. How he'd knelt to worship this thing like a man who knew that hope or pride or joy, or anything with even a hint of goodness to it, was so far out of reach for him, it might as well be a dream. How long was this thing going to keep them down there? How long did it intend to keep me? I wept like a child, feeling like my mind was slowly cracking as I tried everything to stop the thing pulling me into the shadows. I kicked at the earth. I dug into it using my hands, looking for a root or a pipe or anything to hold on to. Nothing. Nothing I did would slow it down. I was no more than a foot from the doorway when Ripley reappeared. A dog afraid of hoovers and plastic bags and doors that move on their own. A dog who once got stared down by a particularly feisty rabbit who stopped mid-chase and turned around, baffling the predator on its tail. A dog you couldn't even watch scary movies around. And he lunged at that arm like he was a wolf, like he'd always been one. And while he didn't quite break the skin, the pressure was enough to make the thing's grip weaken, and I slid my leg out. Unable to stand, I knelt and grabbed the dog and pulled as hard as I could. And now that thing bled at last, as the pressure of the jaws and the sliding teeth ripped into its flesh. Together, at last, Ripley and I were let go and sent rolling backwards head over heels. I wasted no time waiting or looking or processing. I heaved the dog to my chest and crawled until I passed out, making it maybe half a kilometer away. Only when I could no longer see the door did I let myself fall to the ground face first and gave up consciousness. The doctor said I had pneumonia. which I suppose made some kind of sense. I might have even believed them were it not for the sheriff's visit, as I lay in bed about what I may or may not have seen. I dismissed them to the best of my ability. I wasn't interested in chasing that particular nightmare down, figuring out if it had been real or not. At least not while I lay there, half drowning in my own infection. To be fair, I had at least some sympathy for why the police had done so little to seal that place off. I have on occasion thought about going and doing the job myself, but to this day I still have nightmares about being pulled into the dark beyond that door. Not just the bunker door, the one I narrowly avoided at the end, but the one below. What I saw was a kind of madness, I'm sure of it, and I often think of Daniel's words. It didn't need a reason, just an opportunity. Somehow, the Vances were that opportunity. Maybe they built their bunker on a ley line, or a weak spot between dimensions, or the site of former satanic rituals. I'm not sure it even matters. They went into the dark, thinking it'd be a safe place to wait out the world's troubles. But something had been down there, waiting for them, waiting for a chance to get at a family of 7 people, to lock them in and deprive them of an escape and slowly take from them everything it could. I've moved since then. Couldn't help it. It wasn't just the memories, you see. It was the shortwave radio I kept in my basement, something my father passed on to me when I was just a boy. God, I'd forgotten about it, at least until I woke up one day to the sound of it blaring white noise down in the dark. And buried in that sound was the faint whispering of a man, his voice barely recognizable, but unmistakably his. "Let them go. Let them go. Let them go." There's something hiding behind the sun. Our sun has been acting up lately. Storms, flares, coronal mass ejections. I was told it was natural, nothing to worry about. We were just in a solar cycle, and storms on the sun would get worse for a few more years until the cycle peaked, and gradually solar activity will return to normal. But it's not so benign. At first I thought the folks at NASA were keeping things hush-hush because of a potential Carrington event, a solar storm so powerful that it sends enough radiation to Earth to melt the energy grid and send us back into the Dark Ages. As horrifying as that sounds, such an event would be a comfort compared to the truth. Right now, I'm around 94 million miles from Earth. Some of you will realize about where that places me. We expected things to go bad, but not like this. Just a few hours ago, things were still normal. Our spaceship is so damn cramped. No, that's an understatement. It's coffin cramped. We sleep in bunks so tightly stacked that my nose touches the fabric of the cot above me. Coffin cramped. Huh. I'd called it that since launch, but the irony is just beginning to dawn on me. There were 4 of us in the crew. Me, Margot, Ted, and Jin. At 1400 hours today, I felt like I was a little boy again, bickering with my sister on an airplane over the sunshade. But this was, of course, a little different. "Please, Margot," I begged. "We're restricted from opening any ports after 50 million miles. It's my job to enforce shit like this. I'm not trying to be the bad guy." I was trying to act like I didn't want her to open the port covering our spacecraft's only window because I was a bureaucrat. In reality, I was terrified of getting toasted by cosmic radiation. She gave me a pitying look. It was an expression that the rest of the crew had been giving me more and more as the mission went on. They knew more than me. I didn't get the same security clearance briefing as they did. I knew we were looking to retrieve an experimental probe that went dead in orbit around the sun, and that the plan was to retrieve the data it failed to relay and boomerang home using the sun. All in all, the mission would take most of a year. But I didn't get to know all the details. I'm not even an astronaut. I'm a hired gun. I spent a dozen years in the Army Special Forces, retiring as a captain. My selection for this mission should have been the first red flag. But I was too busy thinking how awesome it would be to get to space. Besides, I made a living by not asking questions. I was told I would be the security specialist for the spaceflight. I thought maybe all long missions needed someone like me. It made sense when you thought about it. You put 4 people in a tube for almost a year, and fights are due to break out. Believe it or not, astronauts are not all timid geniuses. There are some gravitational egos floating around Earth's orbit in the ISS. My job was to keep everybody in check. Follow the rules, be civil, or Murphy will handcuff you for a timeout. But 30 days before launch, I was given a list. Things to look out for, signs and symptoms, and I realized I was not just here to keep the peace. Of the more concerning bullet points were things such as: if any crew members experience bleeding that could be hemorrhagic, blood seeping from ears, eyes, nose, or starts speaking in a strange way, mutterings a throaty tone that sounds like another language, immediately quarantine them in the ECP. ECP stood for Emergency Containment Pod. In our tight little ship, 6 of these steel coffins were lined up in the wall, opposite our bunks. Every place you could fit a toothpick was important. So it was god-awful concerning why so much space was allotted for those things. But before I saw any of this shit, the lists, the containment pods, the look of doom in the eyes of the other astronauts, the ink was dry. The contract was signed, and unless I wanted to fake an injury, there was no way out. It seemed like NASA was expecting madness on this mission, and my job was to keep it at bay. And the red flags kept coming one after another, like a clown with nothing but crimson scarves up its sleeve. If you're a big space nerd, you may have heard of the Parker Solar Probe. In 2018, a spacecraft the size of a sedan was launched with the intention of uncovering the mysteries of the sun's corona and solar wind, but it discovered something else. The probe went dark 8 months ago. Me, the rest of the crew, and dozens of top scientists and brass were briefed with a PowerPoint composed of blurry images. Now, the pictures weren't in 4K. The probe uses white light imaging that gives photos a grainy look, like you're looking at a Loch Ness monster. But with the help of the projector and nervous men with their pointer sticks, I was able to understand what I was looking at. There was a black and white blur of stars in the background, and coming out of them, streaked by the speed at which it traveled, was something that looked like a screaming human face. And it was coming right for the probe. It was the last image it took. Sounds kind of funny, doesn't it? But the room was quiet with fear. No one seemed to offer an explanation for why the object that disabled the probe gave us all a bad case of facial pareidolia. Its hollow eyes weren't level, and its mouth was jagged. I thought it could be passed off as some kind of solar radiation interference. After all, no spacecraft or camera had ever been so close to the sun. But I didn't raise my hand. I sat quietly confused as they started talking about the distances between the eyes and mouth. Distances. In the picture, the thing looked close, like it might be 20 feet long. The room came alive with nervous murmurs as they concluded that the facial object that appeared in front of the probe was roughly the size of the Pacific Ocean. Were traveling gas clouds a thing? Or, of course, radiation interferences? But I didn't ask these questions. It felt like every obvious answer was out of the window. Otherwise, the room wouldn't have felt so eerie. They told us the probe was not destroyed and it was lingering in orbit, and our crew had the Herculean task of retrieving it. I was given a folder of the general mission plan, and then dismissed along with dozens of others with lower security clearance while the rest of the crew stayed sitting. I thought maybe they were going into technical details that I wouldn't understand, but as the days and meetings went on, and from the tip-lipped smiles I got in the halls, I knew I was told half of the truth. Looking at it now, it wouldn't have made a difference. Up until hours ago, I still knew nothing. Margot ignored my pleas to not open the sunshade and set her hands on the window switch. "Visors, guys." The whole group was equipped with a gold visor. Sunglasses on steroids, as we called them. They allowed us to look out the window without being blinded by the sun. Hell, they were so effective we could stare at the sun if we so wished. Ted and Jin nodded and donned their giant bug-eyed glasses. It was beginning to feel like we were on a suicide mission, and I was the only one still ignorant of the fact. The cosmic radiation from the window, even for a few minutes, could cause serious complications down the line. I didn't say anything. I nodded gently, defeated. I flipped my goggles on and Margot hit the switch. An alarm sounded and the metal shade began to slip into the wall. We were all silenced by what we saw. No, my blood didn't run cold, nor did my hand stand on end, at least not from fear. 17 million miles away sat our sun, a silent ball of fire, burning almost white against the blackness of space. From as close as we were, we could see the firestorm slowly swirling on its surface, systems of flames the size of Earth. I'm done. Words can do it justice. Mountains, stars, even the aurora borealis swimming pink paled in comparison to this view. The four of us had a moment gathered around the window. 4 faces pressed against the porthole, looking at the beauty so incredible, it was truly indescribable. It was a while before any of us spoke. "Should probably close this up," said Jin. "Radiation and all." "Yeah," Ted snapped to attention like he'd been in a trance. The alarm blared and the metal shade returned to cover the glass. But I kept staring at where the sun just was. Ted and Jin went back to the tiny table that folded out of the wall where their poker hands had dealt, but untouched, and looked at one another. It'd been 122 days since launch, and we were sick of talking to one another. An hour went by and I tried to read, but quickly found myself getting warm. "Ted, can you turn up the cold air? These cooling units aren't meant to last much longer than the mission. We've got to save it for when it gets really hot." "Is this not really hot?" Ted ignored me and I looked at the rest of the crew, but they just shrugged. "Whatever," I muttered and started to read again. But 20 minutes later my stomach dropped. I was sweating so much I had to wipe my brow. There was a sheen of sweat on the back of my hand. I looked up with alarm and immediately locked eyes with Margot. She had her fingertip in front of her as she stared at a bead of sweat resting on the tip. It was getting hot far too fast. Before I spoke, the comm station crackled to life with an electronic voice. "Message incoming. We were so far from Earth that radio transmission weren't instant. This billion-dollar spaceship used what was essentially a fax machine to communicate with Earth." The screen lit up with big letters we could all see. "Base jumper. Confirm your speed and location." Ted rose from his seat with a start. "I told you it was too hot," I muttered.
Shut up! He went to the cockpit and checked some of the instruments before quickly speed-walking back to the comm station. He typed furiously and spoke over his shoulder to us. We're off course and gaining speed. What? You can't be serious. How much speed? Ted leaned back from the screen, biting his lip. 200,000 kilometers an hour. Jesus, said Jin. That's the increase, not the total. We're at 320,000 now. Margot climbed into the cockpit and Ted took a seat next to her. Jin went to the instruments wall just behind them and started giving readings. Everybody had a job here except for me. We're being pulled in, Ted shouted. Cabin temperature rising 2.3 Celsius a minute, Jin said calmly. Don't worry, folks. This thing is meant to withstand the heat from re-entry. A little sunshine ain't no thing, said Ted, but I could tell he was trying to be the man in charge. There was terror in his wide, darting eyes. Engage starboard thrusters. Sunside, sunside. Margot flipped a series of switches. Thrusters engaged. Give him it all! Margot eased the throttle all the way up and the starboard wall began to roar. Although there was no difference in gravity or feeling, I clung to the pole that supported our bunks like my life depended on it. 3.4 Celsius a minute, sir. I need to blast the cooling or we're gonna bake. Do it. Jin furiously clicked the button, sending the AC temp as low as it would go. It blew freezing air into the cabin. With the sound of the thrusters and the cooling system, everyone put their radio sets on. I grabbed my headset off my bunk and moved the mic in front of my mouth. It just doesn't make sense. The thrusters changed our course by 0.1 degrees. We've already reverted. Maybe there was a malfunction, said Margot. Fuel levels suggest normal activation and all thrusters sensors indicate they made it into position. Jin, said Ted, how long can that cooling system keep us at a non-lethal temp? Depends. If you want to be smart but uncomfortable, I can set it to keep the temp below 35 Celsius. We'd be hot, but we'd live. Do it. Roger. Everybody was silent for a moment, and I hesitated to speak. Elements are a funny thing, and I was out of mine. I'm confident under gunfire when there's no evac, yet I felt like a child as these astronauts assessed the situation. So, what's the problem? We're still off course. I don't have control of the ship, said Ted. Margot, Jin, and him all looked at each other. There was some kind of understanding in their eyes, a knowingness that this may happen. Think we're at the farm? Margot asked Ted, and he nodded ever so slightly. What's the farm? I asked. I didn't care about signing naive anymore. I was afraid. We're in a tractor beam. Ted flipped some switches off. The sound of the AC and the thrusters lessened, and he slipped off his headset and stood. We're being pulled by something. You people have to talk to me. To where? Into the sun. Margot and Jin looked defeated. Ted opened the drawer in the wall that acted as his footlocker and pulled out a brown bottle of rum. Want to switch off the comm station, Jin? I swear we're fucking bugged. Oh. Jin powered down the comm station, and the lit up buttons all went dark. What's it matter anyway? Why are you all so calm? I sprang into the middle of the craft. I was beginning to get angry. I had been the dumbest guy in the room for more than 100 days, and no one pretended otherwise. I was damn near a breaking point. Murphy. Ted twisted the cork out of the rum bottle with an echoey pop. This wasn't a suicide mission, I want you to know that. Jin held out a plastic cup and Ted splashed some rum in. Something has been hiding behind the sun. Some structure. We know it can move, since the sun does too, and somehow it always manages to stay hidden. Ted sighed, grabbed a plastic cup, filled it and put it in my hand. But I didn't drink it. He sighed. That probe that was launched a few years ago, the one we were supposed to retrieve, it wasn't sent to study solar activity. It was sent to figure out what the hell our radar was detecting, and why ever since the structure appeared, the sun has been going crazy with solar flares. To be honest, we still don't know, but we have a pretty good idea on what's happening. We have a theory. And what's the theory? The three of them looked at each other, and I set my rum down. We think our sun is being mined. Mined? For energy. I know. Why this sun when there are so many others without intelligent species in orbit? But we figure that they're so advanced they don't care. Our sun was probably closest. The next gas station, so to speak. We're only theorizing here, but based on the strange and concerning strong solar activity that's built up in the last few years, we can tell that something is affecting the energy of our star. So you don't know if any of this is true. What about the symptoms list I received? Where'd that come from? The International Space Station is empty. Evacuated. The astronauts there, they started bleeding and going mad just when the Parker space probe captured that image. Hardly anyone knows it, but we are the only human beings in space right now. And Murphy, I really think you should drink that rum. I picked up my cup and drank the rum in one swift gulp. I held the cup out for more. Why me? I mean, there were so many others to pick for this shit. You'd be shocked at what percent of the special forces fails the psyche eval for going to space. Actually, I wouldn't, I said, and we all laughed. What else could we do? We talked theories for the next few hours. What these aliens were doing. What they needed the fuel for. A couple of times Margot or Ted would head to the controls and try to deviate from our path, or change our speed. But it was clear we were in the power of something else. Despite it all, I actually had a good time. We had human need for levity in the face of death, and we quickly found ourselves drunk and laughing in hysterics. Okay, brass tacks everyone, said Jin after some hours as the laughter cooled after a joke. We can't burn to death, and that's exactly what's going to happen if we stay on this course. There's no way we can make it quick by using the sun. Votes on cutting off the oxygen versus overriding the airlock. Oxygen, said Margot, and we all agreed. Oxygen. Alrighty, said Jin, and I smirked then. I did not think my death would be decided with an alrighty, but after being in the fray so many years, it felt right. I was surprised how well the crew was taking this. They were properly selected. There was no panic. A couple minutes later, Jin got up from the table. We didn't realize he did then, but over the next few minutes our breaths became shallower and shallower. Wait, said Margot. She was suddenly swaying. Jin, did you already? But before she could finish her sentence, she hit the floor hard. There was terror in my mind for sure, but I did my best to ignore it. We typically don't discover this until the final seconds of our lives, but the human mind is an expert in experiencing death. I remember for some reason then, drunk and oxygen deprived, I was thinking of waking up with the window open on a Sunday morning. It was a memory I had from high school. Birds singing, bells tolling, a girl's arm gently curled on top of my chest. I was ready to die. But just then, something heavy hit the roof of the spacecraft. Sparks burst from the control panels and materials flew from their compartments, but it wasn't enough to keep me conscious. I fell to the floor and the world went dark. I woke to a shade being drawn, darkness and then white, unbearable light. It was the sunshade. I was still on the ship. Jin and Ted were on the floor, both on their backs. I stood clumsily over them. "Guys!" I reached down to shake them but froze. Their eyes were gone, and so were their brains beyond. Red, hollow sockets. These men had the eyes of jack-o'-lanterns. "Fuck, fuck!" I screamed. "Shh!" My head snapped towards the source of the sound. Margot was standing at the porthole, staring out into the sun. "Margot?" It brings tears to my eyes every time. I mean, just look at that. I could see the sun out of the porthole, but I wasn't blinded. Why can't I see it? I touched my eyes, half expecting them to be gone. "Because I want you to. But there are more important questions," she whistled a peaceful melody, still not turning from the glass. "I want to share something with you. This view. Come." I looked down at Ted and Jin. I had this horrible fear that my eyes were melting too. "What happened to Ted and Jin?" "This is only supposed to be shared with one. It's a polite protocol." "What is?" "Letting you know why. It's a painful thing to have to wonder. At least one of you shouldn't. One of you should know. And I'm going to tell you. Starting at the beginning, but keeping it brief." I said nothing. "Look at all those stars." I looked beyond the sun to where thousands of stars twinkled, and Margot continued. "Every creature I've ever encountered thinks it's beautiful. Their world, the universe, and God, I do too. Gorgeous," she hissed. "Absolutely gorgeous. If only this feeling could be bottled, sold, enforced. The scale of space, the beauty of it all makes greed and worldly power seem so silly." I shifted on my feet uneasily. I had a handgun for emergencies and started towards my locker drawer to grab it. You would think a species could evolve past such things. But that's the fatal flaw poisoning the purity of all things. You see, even when life reaches the level of sentience to appreciate goodness and beauty, it still can never leave nature behind. The primal drive to accumulate power, the high that comes with it, the subjugation of the weak, the slaughtering of the unknown, the slaughtering of anything that could be a threat. All those basic instincts remain. Margot was still facing the window, and I started thumbing the combination into the lock. Your species did not win its way to the top of the food chain with song and dance. There is no solar system where intelligence ever has. So, all who wonder at the natural world in which they inhabit are built with the cruelty it requires to take it, to lay waste to the competition, and those instincts, and the need to implement them, can't be erased. There is no technology or time elapsed from when we were beasts to rid us of our want to win at all costs. Margot. I stopped fiddling with the combination lock and looked at her back. This is no time for philosophy. I'm not philosophizing, she turned then, and I blanched as I saw that her eyes were pupilless orbs. Something swam in them like parasites. I'm apologizing. What? I stuttered. She was one of them. An alien. Anything but human. You can't have it, I shouted. Take as much energy as you need. Please, please. Energy. I realized Margot's mouth wasn't moving. She was slack-jawed. Her voice came from inside my head. "We're not here for energy. I'm sorry. To you and your people." Suddenly the top of Margot's head popped and a slick metal pole that had been coming from the roof slinked out. It paused in the ceiling, creating a barrier from the vacuum of space. Margot's body fell lifeless to the floor. Her eyeballs had been sucked into her skull, just like Jin and Ted. She had never been speaking. She's been dead the whole time. Whatever spoke was what had been hiding behind the sun. I thought about going to the comm station then. Its lights were still on. I could connect to the internet and send out a message to tell others. And I have. You're reading it. But before I did, something seemed to call me to the window. I could see some kind of obelisk structure nearly touching the sun. It was enormous, with emerald lights shining down its length. But then I noticed it had something like tentacles that were reaching into the sun. Where they connected to the surface, angry storms of fire swirled. I understood what they were apologizing for. The sun wasn't being mined. No, the words of that thing rang in my head. The slaughtering of the unknown. The slaughtering of everything that could be a threat. I stared at the sun, and from fear or beauty or both, I began to cry. They were increasing the sun's activity. The solar storms suddenly all made sense. Soon our star would go supernova. The sun wasn't being mined. No, they were turning it into a bomb. I heard an audio recording of hell, and now I'm hallucinating about it. It was the middle of the night when I heard it. I'd been finalizing a project on Pro Tools when an email came in from my friend Greg. The subject line was, "Let me know what you think." There was nothing in the body of the email, but there was an attachment. A WAV audio file, less than a megabyte in size, and displayed a 30-second runtime. I sent back an email asking what it was. He responded quickly, saying that's what he needed me to find out. I'm not surprised Greg emailed me about it. I'm a sound engineer, and do post-work for documentaries and some low-level TV shows. I mix, design, clean up dialogue, I do Foley and score. I'm good at everything, but not great at any of them. But I also know Tor networking and frequented the deep web using multiple VPNs in a customized sound room Faraday cage I'd built myself. In the second email, Greg told me he'd been sent a file from a Reddit link, which was now gone. The subs were taken down and the spark around it quickly went out. But the file came back online and started moving through Telegram and Discord. More and more people listened to it, debating and theorizing what it was. One person managed to track the file back to the dark web, but from there, it was impossible to trace to an origin. All it had was a name. Inferno.wav. I ran the attachment through 2 full scans of antivirus software I'd modified myself. It came up clean on both. So I downloaded it and opened a visualizer of the sound waves. They were all peaking consistently. I lowered the volume so I wouldn't blow my eardrums and pressed play. The sounds started immediately, an assault on every sensor in my ear. High, low, and medium pitches. It was producing multiple Shepard tones, including in reverse, giving a dizzying, constantly swelling and decaying effect. The inside of my head felt like it was boiling, like a fever. I was unable to fully latch onto everything after the first few seconds. It was too all-consuming, like a bad mushroom trip in a room with no lights on. The darkness just guides you, and if you resist, it gets worse. It felt like it was playing for minutes, hours even. Then it finally ended. I threw my headphones off. I was overwhelmed with emotions and burst into tears. I couldn't explain why. I don't remember a single thing I heard. Like it was all immediately erased from my memory. But I felt like I was changed forever. When I calmed down, I went out back for a smoke and brought a bottle of bourbon to chase it. I felt dizzy and couldn't stand up straight. I leaned against the house and realized the sound had affected my entire ear. It wasn't just my hearing. It was also my equilibrium that was torched. My sense of balance was gone and vertigo was taking over. I had a second smoke and felt my senses and balance coming back. I could hear the rustling in the forest behind my house, dogs barking somewhere on the property next to mine, the cigarette amber burning, my own heavy breathing. I went back inside and quickly felt like a foreigner in my own home. As I entered my office, I felt like I wasn't the only one in there. I hit the power bar beside the door and my entire system shut off. When it did and the room was plunged into darkness, I saw the silhouettes of something appear against the window, on the inside of the glass, in the room. I scrambled to turn the overhead lights on, but the silhouette was gone. I didn't get a good look at it, but it looked like it had two spikes protruding from its forehead. I got my shotgun and slept with my bedroom door locked that night. But neither of those could protect me from what was going on in my head. The nightmares came before I was even asleep. They were horrifying and acted as all dreams do, starting without a point of origin, but continuously moving in a forward momentum. They all ended with me in a terrifying version of hell. I was drowning in lakes of boiling water as fires streaked down at me like sheets of rain. There was an unbearable heat from every direction. I crawled out of the lake onto a moving but solid layer of molten lava. My skin melted and healed at the same time. My eyes burned and mended simultaneously. The pain was excruciating and never-ending, and felt like a burn had scarred the entire inside of my body forever. I woke up in bed, covered in sweat and fevering. It was still early, just before dawn, but I wasn't going back to sleep, even though I was exhausted. I took a cold shower and watched steam come off my body as the cool water reacted with my hot skin. I checked my phone and saw 3 missed calls and a voicemail from Greg. It was urgent and panicking. Greg was seeing things he shouldn't see outside of sleep, but they were in his house, his room, following him, chasing him, attacking him. They were flashes of beings from some kind of hellish world. Greg was touched by something he described as a demon made out of a dark red mist. The touch burned Greg's arm badly. When he woke up, his arm was still burned and horribly infected. He could barely move it, and it seemed to be moving its way up to his shoulder. Greg warned me not to let them touch me. Them. Greg was convinced it was because of the audio recording. He begged me, pleaded with me to listen to the file again, to try to decipher it, figure out where it came from, search for a remedy. The message cut off halfway through one of his cries. I tried to call him back, but there was no answer. I left a message and told him to call me. I texted him the same thing. After that, I didn't know what to do. Everything felt off. I decided to make some coffee and try to divert myself from what was going on. I needed some crisp ambience from the deep woods out back for a new project I was working on. It would be simple and distracting enough. I rolled a joint to ease my nerves and to smoke on the walk. I grabbed my mic, mixer, and headphones and went out back. I have a good chunk of property in my backyard. There are some old trucks and cars, leftovers from distant relatives of the past. The realty is mostly woods and swampland, but has a few paths and trails that cut through it for four-wheeling and snowmobiling. There was a clearing just off the trails I wanted to get a recording of. The wind came in through the trees in a strange way some mornings, and I had been trying to capture it right for a few months. I made it there and was recording for about 5 minutes before everything silenced out. I snapped my fingers near the mic and heard it clearly, but the wind disappeared. No leaves rustling, animals in movement or birds chirping. It was like I was in an anechoic chamber. No direct or reflective sounds, just pure isolation. I turned up all the volume levels on my mixer, but the woods had gone still. Then a snap. Somewhere off in the forest a twig broke, and another, but this time in the other direction. Then 2, 3, 4, right after each other. Something was walking, shambling forward. I did full 360-degree turns, but there was nothing and no one out there aside from the trees. The cracks and snaps got louder, like there were dozens of feet or claws scrambling along the ground toward me. I crouched in fear, covering my head and face, and shutting my eyes as a heavy wave of wind and heat knocked against me. I kept my feet and held still, bracing for more. I waited for the sounds or breeze or heat or anything more to come at me, but they didn't come. I stood back up, opening my eyes to see the forest was dark. It had just been this morning, but somehow it was now night. The day had disappeared. I started making my way back to the path to my house, feeling more and more surrounded by unseen predators. A twig snapped somewhere behind me, and I spun to check. Deep in the woods, something was glowing, moving slowly a meter off the ground. It flickered a deep red and looked like a marshmallow on fire, floating through the woods. It was coming towards me. I froze up. A deep pit in my stomach formed and I was brought back to childhood, to the one time my parents took us camping. As a kid, I burned my sister's face with a marshmallow I let catch fire. It wasn't intentional, obviously, just goofing around, and it turned into a bad accident. But it left a nasty scar on her cheek that I still don't think she'll ever forgive me for. The little ball of fire traveling forward through the trees looked exactly like that flaming marshmallow. I picked up my pace, finding the path and making my way back to my house. I checked over my shoulder and saw the ball of fire was still following me. My run turned to a sprint. I didn't even look over my shoulder or slow down until I was back by my door and it was slammed shut. As I caught my breath inside, I saw the ball of fire float past the window and out of sight. I checked my phone and saw more missed calls from Greg and voicemails. I listened to the first one but had to turn it off. The whole recording was Greg crying in pain and fear, begging for help. I went back upstairs to my office. Whatever we'd listened to had affected Greg in deep psychological and hallucinatory ways, and was starting to do the same to me. I turned the power bar back on and lit up my system and monitors. I sat down and drank more bourbon, though I didn't think anything could take this edge off. I put my headphones on and pressed play on the file. I was immediately thrown back to the familiar and horrified state. The sounds refound their groove in my ear again, and my muscles tensed and shut down. This time, I was remembering everything. Over the years, my ears had become so attuned to nuance, I was able to decipher everything I was hearing from the file. There were horrific, torturous cries coming from the fire, lashing and water boiling and bubbling. I could hear storms of violent nuclear thunderclaps that shot through my head like electroconvulsive therapy. Fiery rain that hit the lava-hardened ground like tiny meteors. Flames whipping against bare skin. pain and suffering. There was something like a huge, powerful generator fueling it all that sounded like it was all very nearly about to explode. A leviathan of bass and sub-bass vibrations, shaking so strongly they were creating some kind of war drum effect. And underneath, there was a rhythm, some strange harmony under the chaos, like chanting or a prayer. Then it ended, and the world was thrown into silence and stillness. The room felt darker, and my body felt like a lead statue about to topple. I sat quietly for several minutes before I felt the world shift back on balance, and my mind wandered right back to where it was. I thought about the sounds, the screams in particular. I'd heard all kinds before. In one documentary I worked on, which followed the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda, I'd heard my first real death screams. There'd been new audio recordings out of some of the towns that had been slaughtered by armed militia. They were horrific. It wasn't just that you knew the screams were real. The sounds hit differently entirely. They landed somewhere deep and dark in your heart. I heard once you could tell fake screams from real ones, because the souls were trapped in the sounds of the real one, and they reached out and held you with an icy grip when you listened. This was something like that, but worse. I felt like I was suffering with the screamers. My whole body had heated, and my muscles were tensing from pressures on different parts of me, like the air in the room was flexing. I stared at the file, sitting there on my desktop between my projects and my music. Inferno.wav. My phone buzzed. I checked the screen, hoping for Greg. But it was my sister, Carly. She was crying. The family wasn't sure how it happened or why, but Greg was dead. Somehow Greg had caught fire in his room. He ran outside and jumped into the family pool. But he kept burning. It was like the water wasn't even touching him. Greg climbed out of the pool, giving up, and died in the backyard. His body was burned to a crisp. The immediate thought was suicide, but there was no sign of fuel or accelerant used. In fact, they couldn't tell how such a blazing hot fire could have erupted on his body without leaving a trail out of the house or burning a blade of grass in the field he'd collapsed in. Carly asked if I'd talked to him recently, if I'd noticed anything strange about him, if he'd mentioned any suicidal thoughts. I was in shock, but managed to offer my condolences while claiming he'd seemed fine to me, which was true. Outside of the last day or so, he was his normal goofy self. The only thing that changed was the audio file he'd listened to. I told her I'd stop by the house later to see them, and thanked her for calling to tell me. When I hung up, it all became real. I had to figure out what the file was and where it came from. I started up a program I'd created that used different audio translation filters to help with identifying languages in some of the projects I worked on. The programs measured for both pronunciation sound and grammatical shape and origin, discerning the language genesis. I was getting back some strange results. At first, I wasn't identifying anything at all. I had to restart the program twice. Then it began partially recognizing elements of words in Greek, Aramaic, Demotic, Hieratic, and Coptic. I separated the dialects, whatever they were, from everything else. The words came out in a strange, lengthy grouping. They sounded like a prayer but worked in a perfect loop, ending on the same notes as they began, which were similar to the shepherd's tone. I put the phrases through a search engine. I only received one result, which led to some back-channel website that explored ancient dead languages. The result gave me chills, claiming similarities to and including the divine language. I sent an email to the site moderator, who was a professor in philology and linguistics, with the prayer translated into a readable series of words, asking for his immediate help. As I waited for a response, I checked the Telegram chat rooms Greg mentioned. They gave me more chills. Everyone posting had been complaining about the same things as Greg experienced. Some of them were more personal. The more frightening stories described watching their friend or family member or co-worker go up in flames 2 days after listening to the audio file. They'd begin by coughing up smoke. Then their skin turned dark, like it was burning. Their insides would begin to melt. Then they'd spontaneously combust, wherever they were. I closed the chat rooms and decided to go out for a smoke. I wasn't going through the woods though, not after last time. I sat on the back edge of the yard and looked out into the woods. I looked at the few old cars in the back, rusting over. I thought about how I used to play in them. I smoked my first cigarette in one of them, first beer, first girl I made out with. They held a lot of memories. Sitting there trying to break down what was happening, all I could come up with was some sound frequency project or experiment or weapon leaked out and was unleashed and was spreading through various social media channels. I'd read about shady government programs focusing on sound waves and how they alter brain waves to suit various needs. Some needs were more malevolent than others, so this idea didn't seem far-fetched. But then there were the hallucinations, and the extreme heat I kept feeling like a fever blanket pulsing over me in waves. All of this was deeper than some Manchurian candidate trick. I knew there was one more possibility, however insane it seemed to think. That the file was, somehow, some way, an audio recording of hell. The idea that there was a hell, let alone that someone had been there and recorded the sounds it emitted and put it online, was insane to me. But here I was. The ambience around me drained out and the burning of my cigarette was amplified. I focused on it, watching it burn. All of a sudden, there was smoke all around me. I tried to get up but was no longer on the back steps. I was in the driver's seat of the rusted Jeep out back. I was seatbelted in. Smoke was funneling through the old truck from the back seats as a deep red was glowing out from it. Something was in the back, a dark silhouette amongst the smoke. I struggled against the seatbelt, but it burned into my hands like it was made of fire. The sounds, the horrifying screaming from the depths of whatever hell was on that file, screeched out from the back seat. Then Greg's voice came from them. "I'm waiting for you, Johnny. I'm keeping your seat warm." I yanked myself forward and shot up in bed. The Jeep and the backyard were gone. I was in my room now, half under the covers, drenched in sweat. I'd been sleeping. Another nightmare had shook me. I got up. The loss of balance was back, like the world had shifted slightly and I hadn't adjusted. I could see into the hallway, which was pulsing with a deep red glow before plunging into darkness. That same levitating red ball of fire, the size of a marshmallow, floating past my doorway, moving towards the stairs down. I walked out into the hallway, the red pulse continuing to glow on and off. The fist-sized flaming ball was at the end of the hall. It moved down the stairs, disappearing onto the first floor. I followed the ball down, putting my hand on the walls to balance myself, but found the walls and the railing were perspiring. Everything was beading with sweat. The air on the first floor was thick with humidity as I walked through it. It felt like gravity was now pushing and pulling horizontally to the sides instead of vertically down. In the main entrance, I could see into the kitchen, which opened up to dual sliding back doors made of glass. They looked out onto the deck, which had a 10-foot drop down to the ground below. A figure was standing on the deck, looking down into my backyard. The figure turned back and smiled. It was me. Then it stepped over the edge of the terrace and fell. I nervously walked through the kitchen and out onto the deck. I peeked over the edge. Heat burned the face of my skin. My eyebrows curled. My mouth went dry. The pits of hell stared up at me, daring me to look away. Pain, screaming and suffering wailed from tiny bodies that looked like ants far below. But they were all people. Millions of them. A hand pressed into my back, and I felt myself go over the edge of the deck. I turned back to see who pushed me, and saw myself there, smiling. I kept hoping this was a dream, that I'd wake up during the fall into hell, but I didn't. I kept falling, and the heat got hotter. I hit the ground like a brick. I felt the hardened molten lava burn through my skin and pulverize the bones in my body as I landed. I couldn't move. I was a mushy liquid that was slowly reforming into a solid figure. I could see blurry shapes rushing towards me, horrific sounds screeching from them. Then I woke up. Or rather, I came to and fell forward out of my chair. I was still sitting in the backyard, having my cigarette. I hadn't gone to the Jeep, or woken up in bed, or fallen into hell. I was still here, and the cigarette I'd just started was just burning into the filter. I was covered in sweat, my clothes were stuck to me, and I felt like I was on fire. I rushed inside and got in the shower, running freezing water over me until my temperature started to drop. Then I started to cough up smoke. I had no idea how much time had passed since I listened to the track, and realized it could have been 2 days already. I rushed back to my office and found an email response from the professor who moderated the website. Unfortunately, he said he couldn't help a ton, as it was mostly unknown knowledge. But he'd tell me what he knew. It was a prayer referred to as a deified chant. That is, a prayer structured like a palindrome, so it could be chanted backwards as well as forwards and elicit the same message. It was used to honor or worship a deity with supreme regard. The use of a palindrome itself could be interpreted in different ways, but the main explanation for it, the spiritual one, was that a palindrome was a message from angels who were watching over you. Therefore, a palindrome could be used to call angels forth for protection. But this deified chant had one portion in the middle that wasn't part of the palindrome, and it didn't appear to be for protection. The word Hellel was detected among the chants. The word translated to hell in Hebrew. Hellel didn't work the same backwards as forwards, which made the deified chant into something else. I began coughing up huge puffs of dark smoke, and my insides felt like they were burning up. I managed to focus back on my monitor and read the final part of the email. The professor offered a simple suggestion: to play the audio recordings backwards. Everything except the one word, Hellel, would play the same, but maybe that word would change the effects. It seemed too obvious. So obvious, in fact, it might actually work. I dragged and dropped the file onto a timeline just to check. I reversed its flow and placed my headphones on nervously, and hit play. The sounds started in reverse, and I began to seizure immediately. My sight went blurry as hallucinations filled my vision, then went black. I felt like I was floating in space. No air to breathe or surfaces to touch. I didn't feel like I was a person. I felt like a spirit, an essence floating through infinity. Then a hole opened up and bright white light poured into the darkness. From the light, I saw bodies toppling over, falling into the darkness below them. The bodies were human-like, but some of them had wings which were burning away as they flew. The bodies dropped from the sky like a blazing red meteor shower. As they hurled downward, their brightness lit up the ground below them. I saw barren, scorched rock and desert, volcanoes erupting and mountains shaking. The bodies fell into large, slithering rivers of boiling water and fire. They screamed upwards towards the sky. The landscape was like a moving canvas, a biblical oil painting showing the fall from heaven, the fall of the damned, the disgraced angel stumbling down through ash and cinder clouds. From the hole in the sky they'd all been thrown from, I saw a vision of the great angels Michael and Abdiel. They were casting out the final, disgraced usurper from their midst. Lucifer, at once the brightest light in heaven, was now the great fallen angel, and he was being reborn as the devil, to rebuild his army in this new fallen kingdom. The light from above closed, and the evils and atrocities of the fallen could only be seen by the red glow of the exploding volcanoes. A horrible explosion of sound shook through the hellscape, and I felt my essence implode from its power. Then I was back, sitting in front of my monitor. I'd pissed myself and a pool of sweat had covered the floor around me. My eyes were bloodshot, and the tiny hairs in my nose had been singed away. All I could smell was them burning. Hours had passed, but I was alive. I took another shower, cleaning myself and cooling down the slight fever I still had. I started to feel better. I wasn't sure if I was in the clear and was nervous to delete the file, so I put it into a password-protected folder on an external hard drive and locked it in a small Faraday cage I'd built. I went back online and searched Telegram and Discord. The chat rooms had gone quiet. The conversations were there, even if the people who had them weren't. And the file had vanished. It wasn't circulating anywhere anymore. Inferno.wav was gone. All that was left were the ashes of people's lives and bodies that had been torched from listening to it. I performed a lengthy online reverse search for any sign of the file, but nothing came up. It completely disappeared online and hasn't reappeared. Since then, I've been trying to get my shit together. Friendships, relationships, work, health, exercise, all of it. Because the biggest lesson I took away from this whole existential nightmare was that hell is a real place. And I never want to go there.